in and out of this, as I said a little bit earlier. But I guess we can go ahead and get started if everybody here is ready. I have given you stage moderation privileges, Antonio. So that way, if like somebody comes up here, has a question or anything like that, and like things get rowdy, because I know how things can be, you'll have the ability to move them back down to the audience. So I guess everybody, welcome to the AMA with Antonio Wolff, Hegelian philosopher. If you can maybe give us a brief rundown of yourself, who you are, what you do, and what interests you, I guess.
All right. So I'm Antonio Wolff. I am basically an everyday person, quite frankly. I live a very, very normal life, work a very common job, nothing special. I am an autodidact. For the most part, self-taught. I did take some philosophy classes in college days, but that's not where I actually got most of my learning from. Most of it I ended up getting interested in issues that weren't covered in any classes, so I just ended up researching them on my own. So beyond that, I normally wouldn't call myself a philosopher, mainly because I take that to be kind of something that has some respect to it, and also people kind of get mad when you say things like that for some reason, particularly if you don't have an academic degree, which I don't. So most of what I do is indeed autodidactic, but I usually say I'm a philosophy enthusiast, which is not exactly the case, because if you pay attention to what I do, it's far more than just being a mere enthusiast. I do write and put out quite a bit of stuff that is original, at least in the way that I present it. If it was out there already, I wouldn't be doing it.
Yeah, so I guess I can start us off with my first question, and I think I'm kind of interested in this. Is what got you particularly interested in Hegelian philosophy?
Originally, two things. First, I randomly got interested in Marxism, completely out of the blue. I just decided one day I was going to be a good intellectual with an open mind, and I was going to look at all sides of positions on an issue. And for some reason, I just randomly decided I'll pick economics, and there's capitalism, Adam Smith, communism, Karl Marx. Flipped a coin. I decided, I'll start with Karl Marx. And ever since then, I just kind of got into the whole Marxist rabbit hole. Funny enough, I didn't go the usual way that people get into Marx, which people have like political commitments already, and I did, but it wasn't the main reason I got into Marx. And I also didn't go the usual route where people kind of go like, read the Communist Manifesto, and then you like that, and you kind of go with other stuff to get into it. I jumped right into Capital Volume 1, which most people, even Marxists, are terrified of. And I fell in love with it. Probably at the time I read it was back in 2012. It struck me as lightning, and I thought it was like the most rational thing I had ever encountered. And of course, the Marxists constantly talk about dialectics, and this guy Hegel just kept coming up and coming up and coming up. And if it wasn't for that, I don't think I would have ever really encountered Hegel for a few years. It's one of those strange things where if you're not in a milieu that's constantly about it, you don't really ever hear about it. And if you hear about it, it's just kind of out of the blue and disappears. So eventually I got really curious about like, what is this whole dialectics thing? Nobody can make sense of it. I really tried. I think a lot of people really try in that they want to know, they keep hearing that this is really important, and nobody knows what it is. Because whenever they try to explain it to you, it just sounds like a bunch of gobbledygook, and you just kind of left wondering, is there really something to this? What's this really about? And maybe this is just mystification, strangely enough. And then the other reason I got into Hegel is I was really into cosmology for a while, particularly physics, cosmology, astronomy was kind of my favorite science topic, but I was into science in general. And a lot of what I was coming up against in those investigations of mine were things that were metaphysical. I just didn't know that they were metaphysical. Usually people who get into those kinds of issues in those communities tend to start talking about natural philosophy, if they talk about it at all, and it's usually just kind of not really to deal with the mathematical or empirical aspect of things, but more like the methodological. And they themselves are not very aware about the specifically conceptual nature of the issues. And so when I got into Hegel, it was for reasons that had to do with the epistemology relating to those scientific questions that I had. And I got into skepticism for a while, not very deeply, but I was interested in mysticism and anti-philosophy. And then again, out of the blue, I just decided one day, like in 2014, to just hit the road with it. And then, after years of circling the drain with Marxist stuff, I'm like, I want to know what this stuff is about. Particularly, I had read some people who had framed Hegel in an epistemic way. And I was very interested in that. That was the most interesting thing to me at the time. I'd kind of come to the conclusion that everything kind of hinged on the issue of, can we solve the epistemic problems that lead to skepticism? Because if we can't, we're kind of just stuck in these relative pragmatic positions, and we can't really claim any truth, and it just kind of models upon models upon models, which I had no problem with, actually. You'd think I would, because I was always I used to be a big, like, I love science kind of guy. Those I fucking love science people. And but when I came to understand the issues that were very deep issues in epistemology with that, I was kind of like, okay, yeah, I get it. There's no final grounding. Everything's kind of castles in the sky. I particularly like this idea called absolute presuppositions from I can't remember the name right now, but kind of a big guy back in the early 1900s, British philosopher. And then when I read that Hegel had an actual answer to this, particularly in the phenomenology, I went ahead and read the phenomenology, or at least tried. I read like the first 4 chapters up until self-consciousness, and a little bit into that. And what did strike me there was that despite the fact that I did not understand it fully, something about what Hegel was doing struck me as having a profound insight into how to solve the seemingly insoluble problem of skepticism.
Thanks so much for that succinct yet incredibly far-reaching introduction. I've been instructed by the server owner at Nirvana to take over from here on out, so I'll just quickly plug the channel if people haven't subscribed yet. Philosophical Plebeians on YouTube's already got a fairly highly trafficked interview with Noam Chomsky up there, so do check it out if you can. Looking forward to the rest of the interview, and I guess until we get some people in the audience, that maybe people are a little shy, because it looks like there aren't any hands raised yet. I can maybe do some warm-up questions, because I have a question myself. I'm just super curious. I know you've gotten into Neo-Confucianism recently. Can you tell us a bit about that? How did this new development come about in your philosophical journey?
Oh yeah. So that's somewhere about 3 years ago. I was having a discussion on my server with friends, and we were discussing geopolitics. And it dawned on me, and this kind of happens randomly. It's happened a few times in my intellectual life, where you realize I actually have no clue what I'm talking about. And I realized that I did not know anything about modern China, or ancient China, for that matter. And so I actually went on this just China learning binge. Despite the fact that, yes, a lot of stuff on CGTN is clearly state propaganda, a lot of it nonetheless is actually just factually true. So it's very interesting to have learned a lot of the developmental things going on in China, particularly with the history of poverty alleviation and just how rapidly that country has changed. And so as an extension of that, I eventually just got interested in the whole philosophy aspect, particularly because I randomly listened to Brian Van Noorden's lectures on Chinese philosophy. If you don't know who he is, check them out. They're very good introductory lectures. They don't go into many details, but he kind of gives you a very good overlook on the general history of Chinese philosophy. So I highly recommend his stuff. And when he got to describing Confucianism, I had, as with most people, just assumed Confucianism was what is actually called in Chinese philosophy legalism. I don't actually know why this is a common assumption, but it actually is. It's sort of weird because when you actually look at Confucianism, it has very, very little to do with legalism as such, although it integrates some legalist principles. So when I listened to Van Noorden's lectures, my ears pricked up when he mentioned certain things about the concept of pattern, which just sounded to me like a completely Hegelian concept, or rather, it sounded exactly as what Hegel calls the concept, a concrete universal, a unity which is differentiated within itself. So that then got me really interested, and I just decided to go, well, what used to like not interest me because I just thought, well, Chinese philosophy is just Taoism, and I didn't even think that Confucianism was a philosophy, quite frankly. And a few other things that were just very mystical, and there wasn't really much to be understood in them. But listening to Van Noorden's lectures on the job, because I luckily had a job that I had a lot of time to just sit back and at least listen to things in the background. So I listened to all of them, was fascinated by it, and I decided to get a book that's a collection of Chinese texts. It's called The Source Book on Chinese Philosophy by, I forget, what's his name? Let me look it up right now. It's a very good book because its primary text, it's by Wing Sit Chan. It's a very hefty book. It's about 800 pages or so. But it's actually really good. You'd think that it'd take a long time to read, and yes, sort of, but it's actually also a very quick read. Like you can become acquainted with the Chinese classics in about an afternoon. That's the classics of Confucianism, so the so-called five classics, as well as the classics of Taoism, the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi. And then from that, in about probably a couple of days, you can get through to the rest of the development up to Neo-Confucianism. And then Neo-Confucianism takes up the vast majority of the bulk of the book, probably about 300 pages or so. And that's the most interesting stuff because it's the most concrete. It's the most, it's where Confucianism arises as an actually concrete philosophy. And what surprised me about all that was just how intuitive it is. It's really amazing that in the West we don't know about this. First we don't know, we know that Confucianism exists, but we don't know that it's really much of a philosophy. Insofar as Neo-Confucianism is a thing, people don't know that it's, one, a genuine philosophy, and two, that it is incredibly intuitive. It has to be the most intuitive ethics I have ever read. It hits so close to home with a lot of the normal intuitions people have about ethics, while giving a really strong metaphysical foundation for why a lot of our ethical intuitions are correctly that way, and why we should not get rid of those too quickly when we want to develop our views on ethics and what is moral.
Awesome. Well, Nirvana said he has a question, so I'll kick it over to you.
So I'm sure that this question was probably eventually going to come up, but you had mentioned presuppositions earlier, and I was going to ask if you had one. What is your take on the apologetic style of like J. Dyer and presuppositional apologetics, or the transcendental argument for God?
I am completely 100% sold on this with Hegel, in that There's one thing that all those positions presuppose, and that is reason. And what I mean by that is that even the radical skeptics still presuppose the structure of reason in order to give leverage to their arguments. And Hegel one-ups every skeptic insofar as he places the question very openly of, why would you think that reason has anything to do with truth? Why do you think there's such a thing as truth anyways? And how do you know that reason itself, is really a valid measure? What is validity anyways? So in order to not presuppose the ultimate presupposition of any sort of argument of any kind, be it anti-philosophical or philosophical, because even mystics have to use reason in order to argue against reason. Then you still have the question, well, why would you trust reason? So Hegel undercuts all of that by just getting rid of the presupposition of what is reason in the first place. And so the question is, well, if we didn't assume what reason is, how would we figure it out? And Hegel has one of two things. One of them is, well, we're going to just get rid of as much complexity as is possible, including just the very idea of complexity itself, which is why he claims that his philosophy begins presuppositionlessly, in that we're just not going to assume the structure of whatever there is, including the structure of being itself. So he says we're going to begin with pure immediacy. There are attacks on this, that that this itself presupposes many other things. I consider all these attacks to be completely misguided, in that they misunderstand what presupposition is about. The problem with presupposition is not that you exist, not that we are already engaging in language and culture. That's not an issue. I mean, that's just the existential fact. You can't get rid of it, and you wouldn't be able to even be thinking if you got rid of it. The problem is how those things are supposedly prejudicing how you conceive things to actually be. So when it comes to the issue of presupposition, the only problem is, don't presuppose what the object is, let the object develop for itself. And particularly with logic, that is the most presuppositionless of them all. The whole thing begins with a structure that is quite literally nothing. I mean, that's the famous Hegelian triad at the beginning, which is being, nothing, becoming. With those, the main issue is that you are trying to think something that has no relational structure. And the thing is, you yourself are already in a relational structure to this unrelated structure. That itself is not a presupposition, that's just a fact. You can't get rid of it. This fact does not have anything to do with prejudicing you towards what you're going to develop out of this by observing the structures necessarily immanent in what you are doing, with the thought of immediacy, with the thought of nothing, the thought of being, the thought of becoming. All these things are sort of these things that you are learning by doing. It's like constructing a mathematical, what would you say? Well, it's like constructing mathematics itself. You're building up the elements, and rather than just arbitrarily positing elements, you're starting with an indeterminate element and just seeing what is happening with that. And you're giving names. So, you're with immediacy, Hegel just gives the name of being. He explains that the whole reason for that is, well, the is in grammar is just sort of this immediate stopper that doesn't really mean anything, but it just signals that something is there, whatever being there means. So, insofar as being, the is simply just this indeterminate, immediate relationship that itself has no relationship. It fits well with the structure that he's beginning of just unrelatedness. Likewise, nothing is this immediate absence of any relationships or determinations. And so likewise, the name fits. And then with becoming, the fact that you have this experience of shifting from the structure of meaning of the is to the active engagement of the lack of meaning and the nothing, that itself is fitting as a name, that when you have the structure of is nothing, that's a structure of becoming historically. In philosophical lexicon, that's what people usually mean, that becoming is the shift between being and nothing. So that's why he gives it those names. People get caught up with thinking that he's talking about this object called being, or this object called nothing, or an object called becoming. These aren't really things in any proper sense. They are simply names of the self-relationships of thought. So going back to the whole thing about presuppositional apologetics, the issue with those, they claim that, well, you just have to presuppose something. And the answer is, well, if Hegel can do what he does, and I think he clearly does, then this whole issue is a non-issue. You don't actually have to prove anything else. You can let go of your prejudices about what anything is, including reason, and you can actually build up what reason is according to its own operations, which would be operations of thought. So, you're not going to formally be doing this. In order to figure out what reasoning is, you have to actually reason about something. So in reasoning about things, we figure out what reasoning really is.
Great, that's a very well thought out answer. I noticed Jordan has joined us on stage. Did you have a question, Jordan?
Yeah, I had two. Well, I one thing is, Hegel obviously I think believes in God, right? So just like to tie on to the last question, do you think the way like Hegel does apologetics by like, I guess not assuming the things that we have to take for granted, is like a radically different type of apologetics, or like so is different in a significant degree than like, presuppositional apologetics, or um how do you see it as like cutting off from that sort of like apologetics?
Yeah, it's extremely different. Funny enough, I think that if the idea of apologetics, particularly religious apologetics of this kind, is that their claim that without God you can't even have reason, all these things. In a way, Hegel will agree in that. The penultimate section of Hegel's philosophy is religion, right before philosophy caps it off again. But the way that this is carried out, rather than presuppose God, Hegel deems that he has gone before you ever have a notion of God to constructing the notion of God or the concept of God itself. So that at the end, there is no question, what is God? Why would God be here? Can you prove God? The very fact that you've gotten to that point in the development of the argument has already been the proof of God entirely. So it's just completely different.
I see. And I guess my other question was just like, I was trying to go through Chinese philosophy myself, and I felt like I got bogged down because like if you like the Tao Te Ching, they use like a lot of aphorisms to try to communicate their point. Is there any like things that you realize along the path that will help you like get through those types of like metaphors and aphorisms that like might be like difficult understanding Chinese philosophy?
I really can't say, because I think it's just a generality of thinking styles that are so different, especially if you're trained, for example, in analytic philosophy. The way something like the Tao Te Ching is written it is aphoristic, but it's also in a conceptual style. The way things move is by a sort of implication of concepts and their meaning, and their meaning particularly as operations, which are not explicit in these philosophies. That is to be sure. That is actually, I have an article coming out probably next month in Epoche magazine, particularly comparing the way that these sorts of dialectical arguments are presented in Chinese philosophy, and the difference between that and what Hegel does, in which like Hegel is very open about how things are working, the way that meaning is operating, whereas in these ancient philosophies, it's all implicit. It's either you get it or you don't. So there's and a lot of it is contextual too, in that you have to just wisen up into like, where would this kind of operation make sense? So something like in the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu says, that the sage does without doing, and of course, in a regular propositional sense, that's nonsense. But if you put in a certain context of like, when would it make sense for somebody to do something without having done anything? The sense that it's meant is in the, like it's being like being a farmer, in which if you understand the nature of plants and you just provide the conditions for the plants literally grow themselves. So you're doing without doing anything. You're acting without acting yourself, because the thing, you're actively in the nature of the thing, but the thing is just doing it, then following its own developmental pattern. So those kinds of things are what are talked about. I suppose that the best thing is like, well, if you're not just used to that, just probably grab a commentary. There's quite a lot of good ones, quite frankly. I couldn't tell you for any because I don't read commentaries generally. But I know that there's plenty of that will give you a pretty good insight into like what kind of thing they're talking about, particularly metaphysical stuff. I think that there are certain commentaries that I've heard which are just kind of weird, mainly because it just shows that they don't really have a mind for this. Another one that's actually even better is the whole thing about the Tao. The Tao that can be named is not the Tao. The name that can be named is not the true name. In which there's this juxtaposition between the Tao is supposedly the ultimate and absolute everything, and yet it's a whole bunch of nothing. And the way that it makes sense is that insofar it is everything, it's not any specific thing. So it's not a thing in the usual sense. And it's nothing only as a negative relationship to the phenomenal world of existent things. It's the same thing. It's the same way in which one could say that pure matter is a whole bunch of nothing, insofar as no specific material object is itself matter as such. So one has to get used to these sort of conceptual relationships.
Maybe is it kind of like like I don't know. It sounds like something like like Plotinus would like describe the one is like you would think it's like ineffable in its very being, but it would still exist and it's transcendent. It's where like all else comes from or something.
Yeah, it's a very similar thing. As a matter of fact, they even say it. They call it the one.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense actually. Other than that, yeah, those are my questions for your answers.
Thanks for contributing, Jordan. I see we've been joined by the God Emperor. Did you want to ask a question to our guest? You can go ahead and unmute if you like.
Yes. As usual with just about any discussion of Hegel, this question is inevitable. What exactly is the dialectic, and what does it seek to, I guess you could say, unearth, or what is its purpose? What is this trying to explain or get across? I have a very unsophisticated understanding of how the dialectic works, but it's kind of difficult to get a sophisticated understanding of how the dialectic works, probably because the science of logic is by far the most difficult text within the Western philosophical canon, probably by far more difficult than the First Critique or Being in Time. And the way it's been usually explained to me is that you take a fixed concept and it's rendered indeterminate through the first negation. So it breaks down into two contradictory parts. And then these two contradictory parts are reconciled through a process called Aufheben, which is the negation of negation. And it grants you an elevated understanding of the two contradictory parts as a unity of opposites. But again, for me, this has never really had the, I guess, explanatory power to really give me a sophisticated understanding of how the dialectic works. So if you can explain that, I would greatly appreciate it.
Sure. That's actually the thing I mostly specialize in. So one thing is that The dialectic is not a method. I know a lot of people talk about it that way. It actually isn't. It's a part describing something that happens in the method. But it's not even the most important part, quite frankly. A lot of people, particularly happened because of Marx. Marxists are the ones who make the whole dialectics and contradiction thing like supreme, but it actually isn't in Hegel's philosophy. Not only that, insofar as there is dialectic, there's three kinds. They're not even the same. There's a dialectic of immediacy, which you find in the first third of the Science of Logic on being, in which you have something that immediately gets supplanted by its opposite. You have the dialectic, which is the one that everybody knows about, which is contradiction, which happens in the Logic of Essence, the second part of the book, in which you have these things in which opposites are explicitly related to each other, such that they co-arise and you can't tell which one is the primary, which is the secondary. Stuff like cause and effect, substance and attributes, all these other things. The idea, usually in essence, is that the essence is supposed to ground the appearances or the conditionals. But what Hegel shows in the Science of Logic version of the essence is that these just kind of not only just flip back and forth between each other, but immediately relate themselves to each other. So that, the moment you have an essence is an essence precisely in that it is what grounds appearances. So already explicitly in the essence, there's a contradiction, or its relationship to its opposite, and the contradiction ends up being that what is essential to essence is actually appearances, and what appears in appearances is essences. And then in the third part of the Science of Logic, you have the concept, which is a developmental dialectic, which is more akin to what you would find in the idea of Socratic dialogue, where you have relationships which are mutually developing each other into a higher position. The way I explain dialectic normally and the way I explain the method overall is that I try to focus on semantics and cognition. The science of logic is, after all, indeed a science of logic, and logic is thinking. Hegel's very explicit about this. It's the thinking of thinking. So being is the structure of just pure immediacy. And immediacy is exactly what it says, not mediated, not related. So it's the unrelated, completely without relationships, including the relationship of saying that it is unrelated, because that itself would be a relationship. So you're given this object, the immediate is. And you're supposed to then, it's a thought, you think a thought. Now, you don't have to be, some people would say this is presuppositional, but I mean, that's just the fact. A thought is to be thought through. Otherwise, it's not much of anything. You just be a sensation, whatever. So you try to think the immediate. Well, because it is immediate, I mean, the very meaning of it tells you that there is no structure within it. There's also no structure outside of it. There's no bound to it because it's unrelated. There's no relationships. So the act of thinking is trying to determine some sort of relationship, some sort of determination, which is going to specify this or that. But in this scenario, there just isn't. So you immediately have a failure to cognize the object, or at least in what you would expect to be implicit in the object. You have an immediate object, it just is, and you're like, okay, I'm going to think it. You try, you fail. This failure signals a different meaning that you can't yet specify as to how it's different, but you do experience it as different. And it's the absence of meaning itself. First is just the immediate meaning. In the immediate meaning, there is no meaning, so there's absence of meaning. This is what then you call nothing. And then from the nothing, immediately you stand back, you notice, well, I've cognized nothing, I've thought nothing, I can't think. Bam, the nothing is, because it has a structure of immediacy again. It's this unrelated thought, but now objectified again. So you have the being, which is just the immediate thought, the nothing, which is the cognition of, or the suspended cognition within that immediate thought, and then back again that the moment you look at the nothing, it immediately is once more. And then this total shift of being nothing, thinking, failure to think, thinking, failure to think, or rather thought, failure to think, thought, failure to think, which you don't have anywhere else to go. That's the only two structural movements that you can actually engage with this given structure. Historically, the fact that things move from being to nothing is just what people call becoming. So this whole circuit of thought, thinking is one self-related thing, which you will call becoming. And then from this, yet again, we do it once more, where we have now the structure of becoming, where I can see that there is a movement from being to nothing, and that is what Hegel calls ceasing to be. And then there's also a reverse movement from nothing to being, which is coming to be. So in those things, you can start seeing that there's a thinking of content, or rather, you're giving an immediate content, you think through it, whatever comes out of the analysis is going to necessarily be different. In the same way that, if you say A equals or A is B plus C and D, those things already are giving you differences which are not there immediately. If you just give an A is what? Well, now on its own, it isn't anything. You still have to specify what it is. And once you specify what it is, depending on how you're looking at it, you might have these issues of, well, it might seem like it's initially a substance, but then it's a substance with predicates. And, really, is there a substance in the end? Isn't it just all predicates? And then with the issue of the predicates is, well, are the predicates themselves substances? So those kinds of issues just prop up. The method ultimately is not a method that you can formalize. So you can't go and say, oh, I'm going to apply the Hegelian dialectic. You can't. It just doesn't make any sense. Rather, the Hegelian speculative method, that's what Hegel calls it, simply concerns these pure abstractions of thought, pure concepts, which when you put your mind in a straitjacket of only having to think within the bounds of these given structures, there are necessary consequences to what you can actually do with these structures. It's like the Legos. If you're going to construct something with Legos, you can only do so in that the Legos lock in a certain way. And you may have many Legos that, have different shapes, but still, the Legos will only snap in together at their certain joints, and you can only construct certain things necessarily by the very structure that they have. So Hegel's philosophy's insight is that pure thoughts also have just these necessary kinds of structures, of which you can objectively not escape.
All right, I appreciate that, and I have one more question regarding Marx. How does I guess the question would be, do you think is the greatest value of historical materialism, and where do you think both Marx and Engels gets dialectics wrong? I've often been told that Marx is mistaken in that dialectics can be used to predict the future or predict the end of capitalism. Of course, Hegel has that famous quote that the owl of Minerva spreads its wings only at the coming of the dust, meaning that you can only really understand things in full in retrospect. So I guess my question is regarding historical materialism, and if you want to elaborate on specifically the Soviet variant that the Frankfurt School, of course, dismissed as metaphysics, dialectical materialism. I'd like you to speak a little bit on that.
All right. So regarding historical materialism, actually, it's depending on which portions of it one is talking about, it can be pretty amenable to the Hegelian conception, or it can't. The crude dialectical materialism that you find in most Marxists, quite frankly, because they take it out of the German ideology, which is an unpublished work, which is quite frankly philosophical trash, if I do say so myself. It's the whole, first there's primitive communism, then you have, slave society, then feudalism, then capitalism, and there's a whole deal of the Oriental mode of production. And you have the whole issue of the relations of production and the means of production, forces of production, so-called dialectic. That stuff is not really properly Hegelian. If you actually read it, Hegel's philosophy of history, which is not that great, quite frankly, I wouldn't recommend it for the most part for people to understand Hegel's philosophy, insofar as there's not much of Hegel's philosophy in the philosophy of history. A lot of it is just sort of these funny little historical details, but it has more of a just typical categorical structure that most philosophy, particularly continental philosophy, easily has, so that you can follow much of what happens just structurally without actually thinking through about anything. I think the only value that comes out of historical materialism is just the idea that obviously we are in a self-mediated relationship where our modes of life and our technologies co-determine, but it always co-determines to the side of what we want. Historically, you can look at plenty of societies which had the forces of production, even the relations of production, which did not do what Marx thought they logically would. China had 500 years before the British Empire, the greatest ships in the world that could have sailed the entire globe and conquered everything. Not only that, they had a pretty developed market economy for what it was worth. And yet China did not go ahead and become a rapacious capitalist hegemon across the globe. They even invented gunpowder, and they didn't really invent cannons or guns for the most part. And those things are determined by deeper cultural aspects of people that are not just simply, well, you have the technology and therefore now things are going to necessarily happen. That's not really the case. It's only under capitalism that certain relationships of technology arise. Before that, you could have plenty of things which, if capitalism and if the drive for the need of constant expansion of production was the case, they would be taken up. But insofar as they aren't, people just don't see a point to them. The steam engine was invented a few times in ancient Greece. Everybody just thought it was a curiosity. Nobody ever thought let's hook up a belt to this and, mechanize some things. It just did not dawn on people back then. Their society was just not geared around that kind of pursuit. So the only value of historical materialism, as far as I see it, is just the simple notion that, yes, insofar as we have social relationships and we have forces of production, certain social relationships like capitalism will produce certain forces of production, and certain forces of production within capitalism will lead to certain relationships. Like the revolution of the internet is one that we've all lived through at this point, or at least people my generation, from the 90s and 80s, in which we've seen how the world has changed on a mass scale because of the impact of these new technologies in the ways that we relate to each other. So that's certainly true, but not in the way that Marxists tend to think on the grand historical scale. As far as something related to that, which is how dialectical are Marx and Engels anyway, in the end, they're not very dialectical for the most part. The only dialectical work Marx really ever engaged in was the theory of capital, and only partially, really. Most of the book is actually entirely, for example, Capital Volume 1, the entire of the book can be understood completely fine with a regular analytic propositional understanding of, if A and B, therefore C. I never had issue grasping that book before I even knew what the heck dialectics were, or whether it had any use, quite frankly. I actually tell people this, that if they're interested in Marx, just go read, G.A. Cohen with the analytical Marxism, because that's about as good as you need it for the most part. Unless you are actually engaging in a philosophical view of Marxism, dialectics does not play a role at all. And people go like, oh, but Lenin said it was important. Lenin wasn't using dialectics for anything. Insofar as Lenin understood dialectics for the most part, he kept his mouth shut. There is, in his notes on the science of logic, there are things that he concluded that he never came public with. And he only started becoming a little bit public regarding the things he had learned. For example, he realizes in his study of the logic that the whole idealism materialism dichotomy is completely false. But he never comes out publicly and says this. He only intimates it in some later reviews of certain things that he writes, but he never openly comes up open with it. It would cause a stir. It's a pretty radical thing to say, and most people would not understand it.
All right, thank you. I appreciated the thorough answers, and I will allow anybody else to take the floor.
Thank you for joining and for sharing your question. I hope that cleared it up. I'll just check the audience. I didn't notice any hands up, but if anyone would like to pop in with any questions for our guest, Antonio Wolf, or I can hop over to this list of prompt questions I got from ChatGPT before starting this wonderful show. Okay, well, I'll just go over to my chat questions here. I think we might have covered this, so I'll just skip the first one. Let's see here. How does Hegel's understanding of history differ from other philosophical approaches to history?
Yeah, good question, actually. So one thing people vastly misunderstand is people think that Hegel is a historicist. And a historicist is someone who thinks that truth is relative to historical moments. So, people particularly quote the whole thing of, philosophy is its time comprehended in thought. Nothing could be further from the truth. Hegel is not a historicist. He's not a relativist of that kind. He does not think that things are true today that weren't true yesterday. Truth is truth always, all the time. Whether truth manifests in certain ways at certain times is a whole different question. So Hegel's actually, this is actually a portion of the philosophy of history that is good to read, the introduction, because he actually explains this position in which he brings up this whole issue of what is history anyways. And he says, is history just merely the laundry list of events that happened? First it was A, then B, then C, and blah, blah, blah. Is history just some random set of events? Is there any logic to history? Is there anything to be learned from history? One of my favorite quotes is, and this is a famous one, Hegel's whole thing is, the only thing we've learned from history is that we don't learn from history. There's actually a second quote in the Philosophy of Right, which precedes that one, which explains that what he means by this is that history, the whole idea that you study history to learn from it is a whole bunch of nonsense. What happened in Rome, regarding political tyranny, the dictatorships, the empire. Even if we have tyranny today, even if we have empires today, even if we have, our versions of Julius Caesar, which you might think is a good or bad person, the context of things today is a completely different context of which knowing what happened in Rome will tell you nothing about what you ought to do and what will be the consequences of the historical moment today. Every people in history has to deal with their history as living history and not as something that this thing happened in the past, therefore I got to do this. No, it's always contextualized. It's always living. You always have a problem, and it's never not going to be a problem. The second thing is the whole idea of, is there a logic to history? Is there a structure to history at all? Is history going anywhere? Is based on Hegel's already proven concepts in the science of logic regarding freedom and the structure of freedom, in which Hegel thinks that he has spied in the historical record of our narratives of the past a more than less clear progression of structures of freedom, particularly at the state level. The famous phrase of, first, there was the idea that one is free, and then there was the idea that many are free, or that some are free, then the idea that many are free, and then finally the idea that all are free. As far as it goes, if you look at our history, the fact that we are here today speaking in the ways that we do about the things that we do basically proves Hegel right, at least insofar as Hegel requires any any proof at all, which he doesn't think that he does. He thinks that the whole idea of empirical verification is a bit of nonsense. But that's a whole different thing than typical empirical science. Such that the fact that the reason we know that history has a certain end goal, that is for a state of freedom, is that, well, we're at the point at which we are in the state of freedom, more or less. We've had the Enlightenment. We have now ideas of self-reflection, self-criticism. We have ideas that somehow things ought to be justified, no matter what. That there shouldn't be any givens. You can't just appeal to culture. You can't just appeal to holy books. And particularly, this whole idea that reason itself needs justification. I mean, this is why we have things like postmodernism, because people don't think that reason has justification, and so people rightfully, at least in the spirit of the thing, bring up the question of, well, why should all these rationalist people who tell us how the world ought to be, should we actually listen to them? Is it really better? Isn't that going to, as Adorno would put it, won't that lead us to Auschwitz and other things? So that's the general gist of what Hegel thinks about history. It's a movement towards freedom. Historically, we have gone from tyrannies up to modernity being a time in which we generally understand that things ought to be justified, at least to the level that we are satisfied. Perhaps not an absolute level, but certainly to a level in which most people find the justification to be satisfactory enough that they accept it and they consent to it. Stuff like democracy is a form of that kind of rationality of, that government should at least be ratified by the people. Stuff like, even things like freedom of religion, freedom of self-expression, gender, sexuality, all these things. And obviously the most important one being the freedom of reason, the freedom to really understand and verify for ourselves what is true in the truest sense.
Thank you very much. Nirvana's got a question. He'd like to know your view on theism. I'm not sure if maybe that's too broad. There's another follow-up from Dark Master. He's asking if you could talk a little bit about how to read. So approach those in any order you'd like.
Yeah, sure. As far as theism goes, I am a theist. I will not say I believe in God because it's not just a belief. I am rationally absolutely certain of it. And Hegel actually is a big reason for why this has come to be the case for me. I was an atheist before. I actually have an article on my blog, The Empyrean Trail, kind of traversing a little bit of the history behind this, in which, I was raised in the typical American Protestant household, went to church, did all the things, and then eventually just kind of things did not make sense. So I got sucked down the atheism rabbit hole back in the day, reading Richard Dawkins' God Delusion, which I still think is a pretty good book, despite all the shit that it's gotten from the philosophical community for being, inadequate for, debating theological theism. The high-standing or more rational, erudite forms of theism, which are not the theism of lay people. So, I spent a few years doing that. At first, it was quite an eye-opener, and I really was convinced by the rationality of it, that insofar as what the regular person means by God and understands by religion, it is nonsense. It's not until probably around 4 years after I became a convinced atheist that I started becoming more open to the ideas of, well, what is God anyways? And I encountered things like pantheism, in which, the idea of God started to make more sense as, if reality is, as a whole unified, of which there is a grand assumption there, at least initially, then the whole world is one thing, one being, really. And it doesn't make sense that, if what you mean by God is this ultimate being, which does not necessarily have to be conscious. So for example, much of pantheism is about an unconscious God, where God is more of a force or power. ideas like that make perfect sense, and I think, and pretty much most atheists would look at that and say, okay, I can respect that, but that's not what it makes sense for me to call God. And so they're like, well, I wouldn't call myself a pantheist, even though, yeah, I could agree with it, because I just think I'm just talking about the universe. And I thought the same thing too. I thought, people like Spinoza are really atheists. Just they don't have the label. It's not until much later that I started getting into ideas of personalism. And that's actually a very recent thing, happened probably the last 3 years, I think, in which the idea of a personal God and God having a personality came to make sense to me, particularly thinking about certain things about the concrete universal with Hegel. And that is itself a very difficult argument to lay out. It has to do with the sense of absoluteness and that whether you can rationally have an absolute that would be unconscious by Hegel's standard. No, you cannot. The very idea of, even logical, rational absoluteness requires the self-subjection of reason, such that reason becomes a subject for itself, because reason must reason about itself actively, and therefore come into its own self-accord to verify its own truth. So, if that's the case for reason, that's much more the case for an actual existential absolute. And that would have to be the case insofar as the world exists. It is absolute, it's fully self-determining. If one thought that absoluteness just ends at this finite perspective of the human being, where all we find out is that, well, okay, reason can self-ground, and we understand that reason is pure self-determination, you have to make the step then that reality itself must function this way. So that reality itself must be some sort of meta subject. But it's still not the typical subjectivity of the God that you can pray to and talk to. Not to say that that's not possible, but it's not the necessary case. And that if there's a relationship of personality to God, it's not in the relationship of you speaking to a finite individual, that would respond to you in that way, but rather you communing with a higher sense of self than one normally speaks of. It's a very odd thing. It is in line with the typical conclusions of Christianity and its general theology, metaphysically, but it's not exactly tied to those. I mean, Hegel does say that he thinks that Christianity is the highest, most true religion and the last religion. I don't think it's going to be the last religion, but I think that logically speaking, it is the last religion, the last religion in the sense that any religion that comes after Christianity is either going to be the same kind of logical structure, or it's basically going to be some kind of inferior structure that devolves into, something prior. Stuff like Neo-Ageism is just kind of a devolution of the rationality of theology back to subjective paganism and all these other things. Yeah. So it is a very odd thing. As far as how do I know this and what is the proof for this? Is there a proof for this? Yes, there is a proof. Actually, there's a good book by Hegel called the Lectures on the Proof of God, in which he basically goes over the three major Western proofs: the cosmological proof, the teleological proof, and the ontological proof. Where he says these are all true, but alone they all have failed because they don't really play out what they properly ought to play out. As a matter of fact, they're sort of self-refuting, contradictory, which is not a normal argument that people make against them. It's a very strange argument when you actually think about it. Hegel points out some things that are very weird about these arguments, just in the very way that they're phrased, the very way that they're conceptually structured. Such that, the cosmological argument about contingency and necessity ends up being true. It's just not true really it's true about God, but God isn't really the place at which this proof arises. This proof is just simply a proof about the metaphysical aspects of contingency, necessity, and absolute necessity or substance. Stuff like the teleological proof interesting enough, does not function the way that the typical teleological proof functions. The typical teleological proof is the proof of by design. That, well, the world seems designed, and just as a clock has a clockmaker, the world must have a maker too, a designer. Hegel does acknowledge that this basic argument exists, but he says that's not really the interesting one. The more interesting argument is that the proper teleological arguments have to do with a logic of organisms, of self-design rather than designed by another. Because if God is a designer, there is no other to God. God is designing themselves. And just like organisms, where an animal, grows itself within the womb and, from its own resources designs itself. God likewise is such a thing. And interestingly enough, moral arguments, like Kant's moral argument for God, is a teleological argument of this kind, in that it requires an organic link between what is and the good, such that the good is imminently growing or developing out of what is, what is being usually considered to be defective, imperfect, and other things. It's very interesting that Kant himself put forth arguments like this and didn't realize that it really is a teleological argument. And finally, the ontological argument. Hegel's critique of the ontological argument is funny, because it's also a different one than most people place. Most people critique the ontological argument like, well, you're assuming that concepts could be real. That just because I have a concept of a thing, somehow that necessarily leads to some kind of judgment about existence. And the typical argument against that is, well, no, I can think of a bunch of things and just define them whatever way I want. That doesn't mean that they exist. Now, regardless of whether that attack actually works or not, it actually doesn't. But Hegel's own attack is on the ontological argument is it assumes that being and reality are that concepts and being are different. So it's the opposite. The usual argument is it assumes that they are the same, and Hegel says no, it's assuming that they are different, and that's the problem. Now Hegel ends up being very clear that he thinks that he's developed the only ontological argument that actually works, which would be, at the minimum, an argument from the finite to the infinite. But really, the ontological argument is the thousands of pages of arguments that range from the science of logic all the way to the philosophy of religion.
Great. So we've got Messi in the audience who just put their hand up. I don't know if you want to join right now. We do have a couple audience questions, but we can put those on pause for an actual speaking participant. Over to you, Messi. Thanks for joining.
Good afternoon, Mr. Wolf. Big fan. My question is asking what Hegel thinks on social reality. What would Hegel say to a modern day moral anti-realist, someone that believes there's no such thing as an objective moral fact, and that we're all self-sufficient individuals floating around trying to maximize utility or something? Thanks.
Yeah, that's usually the domain of the philosophy, right? So people bash on like, well, that's a social construct. Yes, and people just assume that because things are social constructs, well, that's either inferior to reality or just completely unreal. Whereas Hegel reverses things. The fact that these are social constructs makes them more real and actually more objective than natural laws themselves. Just because, for example, you can steal from somebody within a state of law in which stealing, there is a concept of stealing because there's ideas of property rights. Just because you can do that and get away with it doesn't mean that there's no objectivity to the right of property. And you say, well, it's only enforceable insofar as anybody enforces it. Yes, but someone does enforce it. And in fact, you live in a society in which, for the most part, people abide by that objectively. Whether they subjectively like it or not is a different question. But they do abide by that objectively, and there are objective consequences. If people respect each other's property, well, you can leave your house and not worry that you won't come back later after work and your house is being emptied because your neighbor decided, well, he's out. his stuff is good for the taking. I don't believe in property rights, and therefore, whatever I can take is mine. The fact that you live in a society that generally does not happen is a pretty good sign of the objectivity of these things. That there is a greater reality of freedom when we abide by these kinds of rules, which are not simply arbitrary rules. Hegel does give good arguments and developments for why these are necessary aspects of having a free life in the first place. Because if you don't have property, well, you don't have a way that you can have a place in the world. You can't even own yourself, and therefore, somebody else can just dominate you and enslave you. The fact that the only thing you can have is the things that you can possess. Animals themselves have possession, but they don't have property. Once you have established something like property rights, it gives you a whole domain of freedom which you did not have before. You can do so many more things. Now you can have not only just the objects which you can leave safely at home, knowing that it's not going to be gone when you come back, but now you can also have a home which you can design as whatever you wish. It can express whatever you want. You can have objects which are the property of you, which others may not touch. You can have a fence. The fence is yours, and you can be sure that somebody's not going to wreck your fence just because they randomly feel like it, or that if they do, at least there will be consequences. Likewise, everything from laws to in civil society, as well as family, all these other things are structures of rights, structures of freedom, which further and further enable you to be a freer and freer being. If you have property, you have that much more freedom. If you have laws protecting property, you have that much more freedom. If you live in a family, you have that much more freedom. If you have an education, you have that much more freedom. If you have the capacity to engage in the way that your economy works, you have that much more freedom. If you have a way to engage with the way your politics functions, you have that much more freedom. So freedom is the basis of all these things, and states that are freer tend to just produce things that are more long-lasting. Now, it's not the case that a freer state necessarily will be a temporally long-lasting state. I think that historically it seems that freedom of this kind lasts relatively very shortly. It's a very short lifespan, and most of the time, historically, people are in a bunch of drudgery and tyranny. But within those spans of freedom, a lot of great things are produced. Philosophy, artworks, all these other things that end up lasting long after even these states themselves are gone. We still appreciate the works of the Greeks, the works of the Romans, the works of the ancient Chinese, and all these other things. I mean, as far as things being embodied that are substantial and long-lasting, nothing beats ideas and culture as these things which are almost immortal.
Great. We've got a question from Quantum Foam 9. Is it a sign of a good philosopher to minimize the work a reader must do to understand her ideas upon reading?
Yes, it is. And but it must be said that ease and difficulty are misunderstood in the regular way that people think about them. Uh, People think that ease and difficulty have to do with familiarity. That if you encounter something and you go, "Oh yeah, I know that," and you could just keep reading it without thinking too much, uh, that this means that things are clear and concise and all these other things. No, usually this means that these things are actually not being clarified, and you're thinking about them at all. When you encounter something genuinely new, even the simplest things, it is difficult because you have to stop and actually think about it. And thinking, even at the most simplest, that takes some time. Uh, like Hegel is extremely concise. Once you understand how things work, every little bit, every little sentence, Hegel is like one of the most dense philosophers ever. There's almost nothing superfluous in what he says. Every word in every sentence means something very specific and tells you exactly the kind of meaning that he's going for. Uh, it's a form of hyper clarity, but something being simple because it is simple and because you're not used to it, because it is genuinely new. is very, very difficult. Most people just do not have the experience of thinking this way. And it's not Hegel, by the way. I've come to realize over time that this is actually the way that philosophy used to be written, generally. If you read something like Socrates, the Platonic Dialogues, the kind of thinking that goes on there is the kind of thinking that goes on in Hegel. It's this developmental, non-definitional way of operating in which you're thinking through a content and its consequences. It's like constructing a triangle in geometry. You have to do the motions, and you have to pay attention that if you put the compass in a certain way, the compass will only have a certain reach. That, if you want to construct a triangle, you can only have certain relationships. You're limited by these things, and people are not used to that kind of limitation. It requires self-discipline, and part of that self-discipline is having the humility to say, I don't really understand this. But what most people, I know a lot of people are humble about this. They're willing to say, I don't understand this, but they don't understand why. Most of the issues in my experience with people understanding Hegelianism and Hegel's writing is that they don't know how to put away their preconceptions of things. That if Hegel says being, they want to interject with what they think this should mean, and they can't get away from it. Because if you could just get away from it and just go with exactly what he's saying, it's a pretty straightforward construction. It's very simple, very clean for the most part. The language is not difficult at all. As a matter of fact, one of the surprising things that I've found is that you can explain this to a regular, unphilosophical person in a very quick and clean way, which sure is not exactly perfect to the meaning of the thing, but is close enough that, you can be sure that this person acquires something like 80% of the meaning at the very least, even in regular everyday language. It is incredible. I don't know any other philosopher that I can do this with, quite frankly.
So, what would you say is the main errors that the beginner might make when starting to tread into this material?
Yeah, error number one is not putting aside their preconceptions and just willing to go with it. I mean, you don't have to go with it in like hook, line, and sinker and go like, oh, well, I'm a Hegelian now. But just be willing to put aside your preconceptions. Go with what he's telling you, because he's pretty clear. For example, the beginning of the logic, a lot of people just find a lot of trouble with it. Although it's the simplest thing. It's just don't assume anything. Don't assume the unassumption. With being, it's unrelated. So therefore, the very meaning of it tells you can't think it. That insofar as you're going to try to engage this, dig out content, you can't. And then the experience of this failure is what then leads to the next thought of nothing. And he describes it pretty well, pretty straightforward. I don't know that you can actually do better than the way he describes it. There's some places in which I think you could, but for the most part, Hegel's just very straightforward. The way I learned a lot of this stuff is, one, I did get my preconceptions out of my head, insofar as one can, but then I treat it as sort of linguistic word games, and that helps in a way. Now, I don't know how common that is, actually. I don't believe it's very common that people think and are used to practicing and thinking in riddles, because riddles often require this sort of analogical and linguistic thinking of noticing patterns that are just in the structures of the way that you say. One of the things is like there's a riddle that someone once told me about. Somebody's house was on fire. The windows were all locked. The chimney like burned out the whole house. How did they come out? And I'm like, wait, what? And the answer was, well, they come out in the front page news the next day. It's this kind of clever linguistic wordplay that happens. That actually does happen in a lot of this conceptual thinking. It's not exactly what is happening, but it's related to a lot of what it is happening. Such that, if you think about being and you're like, okay, being is everything. Well, if the thing is everything, it's no specific thing, therefore it is no thing. Therefore, being is nothing. Those kinds of things are the kinds of ways that you can start making sensible out of this.
Do you think a lot of people make the mistake where they think the being is their own being, as opposed to, it sounds really like a universal being that's being discussed.
Yeah. I think a lot of people get stuck up in like their own, like a sort of phenomenological exercise of this, which it kind of is, but it can't be tied to your individuality. So a lot of people are like, oh, if I try to blink my own mind, I experience this. Well, no, you have to blink even whatever you experience and just go with the structure. Like you're given something unrelated or something absolutely universal. Given this, could you ever specify it? If the only word in the language was being, how could you communicate anything to anybody? Their being, your being, the activity you're engaging with and speaking is being, the birds outside are being, the sky is being, everything's being. So if you say being, you specify no thing.
Well, that's very helpful for me for sure, because I have not delved too deep in this stuff, and just at a cursory glance, there's, as was mentioned in the chat, that there do appear to be some proprietary definitions that some people consider problematic. Is there any way you could comment on that?
Yeah. How do you know that your concept is, the concept? Because that's part of the issue of the Hegelian question of philosophy, of like beyond reason. Like the whole development of reason is development of concepts, such that how do you know that being really is what you say it is? What if it isn't? What if it's this or that? Anybody can specify and posit any definition they want. Uh, the people get caught up with names. Just because Hegel calls the beginning being, for the specific purpose that being is just a more general abstract thing, linguistically, does not therefore specify that he's talking about some specific being of any kind, or he's saying that there is a thing called being. The logic is a logic. It is just simply about thoughts. There is no thing called being. Ultimately, what you find out is that being is a determination of the concept of reason itself. So, Hegel talks about thought determinations rather than things, because there is no thing called being out there. There are no things called essences. There aren't even concepts out there. It's all determinations of one single thing, aspects, attributes, predicates, whatever you would want to call them. But they're not independent things, and they're all parts of this one thing, of which reason is the most clear self-grasping of.
Well, thanks so much for that great explanation. It sort of brings me to another question. Feel free to ignore it if it's too out there, but I was wondering if you ever had any thoughts about how much of these conversations, like between different philosophies, is boils down to a debate about definitions. And I don't know if you have an opinion on that. If not, we have a same speaker from before joining back, maybe with another question. We'll get to you right after that. Thanks for joining back.
All right, yeah. Yeah, I think literally all disagreements are disagreements about definitions, fundamentally. Spinoza has a great quote on this. I forget what exactly it is, but he mentions this as well. People have noticed this for quite a while, that just because we use the same words does not mean that we're actually talking about the same thing. Even in the everyday life that we live, there are many times in which we think we're talking about the same thing, but we actually aren't. If you suss out the details, it turns out that there's always some kind of actual difference going on, where that's kind of jamming the gears of communication. Which is why I personally do not engage in debate. I think debate is utterly useless. Someone saying, "Here's my proposition, then here's my reasoning following this proposition and its consequences," and somebody else says, "Well, I have the opposite proposition, and here's my reasoning about that." One, that assumes that you have a ground in which you even agree about what you're talking about. Between the theist arguments and the atheist arguments, for example, especially in the philosophical side of it, not the lay side, but the philosophical side, what is meant by God is not at all the same. The philosophical theologians are talking about a very metaphysical, abstract things. Oftentimes, in fact, basically most of the time, unless there some kind of making a distinction between being and the one, like Neoplatonists do, they will straight out say God is being, God is reason, God is these things. If you posit that kind of definition, it is if you really understand what is meant by that as an atheist, you can't really argue against that. What you can argue against is, what does that really mean? You can argue then, okay, if this is God, what really is then entailed in God? Is it really entailed that God is going to be a personality, that God would do weird things like conceive themselves, within a virgin, give birth to themselves, have themselves be sacrificed to themselves to be accepted as a sacrifice, to cleanse the world of sin, but sin only exists because God already decided there is sin. Those are the kinds of arguments that you can actually engage once you've laid down the ground rules of here's the definitions we actually agree on. If you don't agree on the definition, such as an atheist, you go against one of these philosophical theologians, and you say, well, no, that's not what I mean by God. Well, then the debate is over. There is no discussion to be had. There's no communication because you're not even talking about the same thing. Which is what that's why I say, debate is useless. Either one or the other person has to give way to just taking what the other person takes as given, and then just suss out what is really consequential to that, given what has been given as. If the atheist says, well, I think God is this, well, okay, well, let's suss out what is consequential to that, and does your argument really follow? And then, of course, that takes a lot of patience and a lot of time, and it's not always worth your time, quite frankly. I can't take the time to give that kind of charitable perspective to somebody who comes and tries to argue with me about things, and in which I'm going to say, look, I'm going to take your point of view and try to show you the problems with your point of view internally. Which is why part of my server is the rules are I'm not here to convince you of anything. If you want to find out, ask me anything and I'll tell you. But if you want to argue about like I don't think that's what being is, or I don't think that's what God is, well, good for you. There's no discussion to be had. You believe what you believe. I know what I know.
We've got a question in the chat. Why would a scholar expect what he says to be consonant with what we do in a colloquial sense in the context that Hegel wrote in a different language centuries ago? And then we'll go over to you after that, God Emperor.
Because the everyday life is already a metaphysical life. There is an intuitive way in which everybody's familiar with the word being, and you said, like, that thing is right next to me. Everybody knows what the is means. They don't have an explicit philosophical understanding of it, but they know what it means. You could communicate with people. The approximation of philosophical language to an everyday language is very important in that the whole point of language is to communicate. If you're a philosopher and you're just making up this whole new language that is very alien to the way people normally conceive things, that's sort of an antisocial thing. And there's plenty of philosophers that do this, quite frankly. And you can tell that they have a disdain for the public and the masses. And the second thing is that, if you know the truth, right? If the whole enterprise of philosophy is to figure out truth, you want to communicate it. You don't want to create the truth in a way that is not communicatable. Now there's a sense in which there are times in which there is no way to frame this in any normal understanding because the normal understanding just doesn't. So you got to bring in words that are alien. You got to coin new words. That's why someone like Heidegger speaks in what initially seems like gobbledygook because he thinks he's bringing in an insight which is not the normal insight. And so to talk about it in normal terms will get people to have the wrong connotations about what this means. Someone like Deleuze also does this in many ways. But then someone like Deleuze also taps into the way in which people normally talk about things and then uses word names very consciously to refer to these intuitions so that it makes more meaningful, immediate sense. You may not believe this, but if you read Hegel and just assume an everyday layman understanding of terms, barring some terms that just don't exist in English, like sublation, Aufhebung and all those things, barring those, you're probably at least 50% right on the money with whatever you think he's saying. So it's not a completely unintelligible thing, and that is valuable if what you are intending is to communicate the truth and to communicate the truth universally.
Great, thanks so much. Did you want to unmute Gun Emperor with your question? You are.
Yes.
Go ahead.
I have a question regarding negative dialectics and the Frankfurt School's work more broadly. Are you familiar with negative dialectics, and how exactly does it relate to Hegelian dialectics? Is it dialectics at all, or is it more of a subversion of it? And do you kind of buy the central thesis of the dialectic of enlightenment, which is that enlightenment rationality is totalitarian and leads to like domination over humans and nature? One of such manifestations is like fascism.
All right. So yes, I am familiar with negative dialectics. I haven't read Adorno's work on it, but I've encountered Adornians, so I'm going to go by secondhand information on this. Negative dialectics is dialectics, insofar as that, the whole thing about dialectics is the self-contradiction and the self-vanishing of things, the way in which things just self-undermine and destroy themselves. So, this is the kind of dialectic which is actually very easy. It's a way that you can pull out a contradiction of just about anything. You see this in Marx, particularly early Marx. If you ever read the 1844 manuscripts, Marx is very masterful at this. You see this sort of thing also in the Kantian dialectic and the transcendental dialectic, where the whole point is to show that these things, particularly with Kant, the whole point is that opposite things can be argued with equally validly. And so, if this is a contradiction of a sort in the sense of pure reason, in that you can affirm both at the same time, and you must affirm them, and you must deny them as well. That insofar as you can argue for their truth, you can also argue for their falsehood equally as much. So, you can't really choose between one or the other. You're sort of left in this skeptical limbo of, which is it, what is the case. With negative dialectics, you have things that just self-undermine. This is what Marx thinks he's doing with capital, where he's showing that capitalism will self-destroy eventually. That its very logic is contradictory and that it will undo itself. Likewise, I think that the idea of negative dialectics is that a lot of what happens in modernity with capitalism is going to lead to the self-destruction of the entire, not just system of economics, but the entire cultural system itself, including perhaps even the destruction of humanity. I do see where one would see the dialectic of enlightenment to be true, to the sense that the mechanistic, capitalistic, and these two things go together, but they didn't come in tandem at the same time, do lead to a certain kind of ends over means, as well as just pure means, and it ends up being pure means in the end. This is what pragmatism, all these other things end up being. Since you have no specific things that you can do, what modernity ends up and the Enlightenment ends up focusing is the formality of things. So it's not what you do so much that is important as how you do it. It doesn't matter that what you're selling people, so long as you're doing it according to the laws which govern private property. Whether what you're doing is unethical, whether it destroys the fabric of society, the libertarian ideal is, well, if somebody wants it and somebody agrees with it, it's all perfectly fine, because all that matters is the way you do things, not what you do. But that's a very limited view of contradictions. That's a very limited view of the Enlightenment. Adorno isn't the first one to notice that the Enlightenment was a self-undermining process. The German idealists all thought so, for various reasons. But things, when they are contradictory, don't just destroy themselves. That's the difference between Hegel's speculative method, which does not end at dialectics, but oftentimes when they are true dialectics, well, not often, but always when they're true, they will engage in a system in which they co-constitute and determine each other, and create a new domain, whether you are aware of it or not. It's like the same way that, look at the internet. The internet can be used for good and bad things. As the internet has developed, we have had to develop certain relationships within the internet to bring things to a stability such that things don't just blow themselves up, and we can maintain these tensions pretty well. The idea that back in the 90s, that the internet would be this democratizing force of learning and free expression. Well, what has happened eventually? The things have been reversed. Now, rather than being a democratizing force of information, most people are just fed whatever propaganda the main government wants, or usually filter through, at least in the West, through corporations who do that censoring aspect. Algorithms feed people things that they think people will like, and therefore people get tunnel visioned in culture and all these other things. So we've gone from one extreme of the Wild West freedom of the early internet to this very highly regimented internet today, in which, quite frankly, a lot of it is garbage. Especially I remember in the old days of YouTube where it was so much easier to find things. Nowadays, you can't find anything because the algorithm is trying to give you what it thinks you want rather than what you're actually looking for. A lot of what's spread out, unfortunately, is misinformation and disinformation. The most popular Hegel videos are completely garbage. As a matter of fact, the most popular philosophy videos are complete garbage. Pop anything is usually garbage. But since it's what's most digestible to people and most immediately apprehensible, it's what people glom onto and go for. So rather than being this enlightening machine, it's turning to be dumbing us down in many ways. But within that, there's still the qualities of the internet which are positive, such that we could dial things back socially, such that we can get rid more of these algorithms that force feed us a lot of this garbage, which we aren't even aware of, and which just because it's there, we get habituated to it. We could get more clear standards on social media where actual things of quality are presented and put forth, rather than just whatever happens to be blindly democratically be pushed by the algorithms just because something takes off, and whether it's true or not. So it's not that the internet will now destroy itself because we have this contradiction between it could have been completely free and great source of information to now it's just this sort of these walled off gardens of people in echo chambers, quite frankly. There is a way in which you can have these walled gardens which could also be quality. There's no essential destructive contradiction there. There's a tension, yes, but it doesn't necessarily have to self-destroy. Likewise, market economics is not essentially completely destructive. We see this historically. It's not 100% rapacious capitalism all the way. People aren't stuck slaving away, on subsistence wages, just barely scraping by. Even when we say that nowadays, this is at a level much higher than, say, somebody who lived in the 1900s, who really was scraping by and had no access to culture. There was no public education. The quality of housing was even worse. The quality of the food available was even worse. and you didn't have things that were easily accessible like libraries and internet, all these other things, so that if you wanted to educate yourself, you actually could. Nowadays, a lot of people just don't use the positive aspects of the societies we live in just because, well, they don't want to. You can blame the general societal standards that we have for creating people with a subjectivity that doesn't want to go towards positive things, but that's a whole different issue. The issue of whether it has to be necessarily self-destructive is, I think, pretty clear. You can have market economies that are completely rapacious. You can have a pretty stable and good relationship between workers and capital, where it's not going to be complete without tensions, but the tensions are manageable. Just look at China, for example. China controls their capital pretty well. In China, if you're a billionaire, you do not run the country like you do in the U.S. That itself has its own problems, but there are solutions, and as it tends to be, there's a little bit of A and a little bit of B, but it's not just mashing it together. There's actually a certain way that things properly interlock. There is a proper way to do things.
All right, thank you. One last follow-up question before I'm going. I see that on your channel you have some Kojeve lectures. What's your evaluation of Kojeve's reading of Hegel and his overall influence on French continental philosophy, Lacan, Sartre, Derrida, so on and so forth?
Kojeve is pretty bad, but if you can bracket away his interpretation of Hegel as just him putting forth his own views, he's actually pretty good. I think he was a decent philosopher. I think he was a true philosopher. He really had the fire in him. And there's at least one lecture of his about the Hegelian wise man that is pretty true to what the Hegelian project is like. And that's the only lecture that I recommended. It's also pretty beautiful, I think. He was a great lecturer. He was also a great writer, very good style.
All right, thank you.
Great. Well, thanks for coming up. I'm not sure if we have any more hands up or questions in the chat, but if there's no more questions, we'll probably wrap it up soon. Antonio, is there anything you think we should have asked but haven't asked yet?
I see we have Nirvana here. You can ask a question.
Welcome back, Nirvana. Thanks for joining back. Oh,
Now he's
back
got-
on again.
Okay, about that. Jeez, my it glitched.
We're still having a bit of
My Bluetooth audio. I'm sorry. I wanted to say thanks, Antonio, for stopping. Okay, never mind. Piper's here. Never mind.
It looks like we have another.
How does this work? Where do I go to put my speaker on for my phone?
You're actually coming through loud and clear, Piper, and
Well, no, I mean for my end, right? Because you guys are low because my phone's not on speaker, and usually you can put on speaker for Discord, but with this stage shit, I have no idea what's going on.
Just put it to your ear. Got to do it the old school way.
Kind of funny that to think that we're gonna live to see the day we're holding your phone the quote old school way is gonna be unheard of.
Yeah,
I've seen a lot of people
it
with
won't
it
be a brick.
right in front of them, almost just like a trough that they're eating from, or a barf bag on a plane or something. That I've seen some odd. Anyway, there's a little comment there. Piper, how's it going? How's your audio there? Do you have a question for Antonio? Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess give me a second to figure this fucking out.
Soon the old school way will be this right here, and we'll have the phones integrated into our brains.
I mean, that would probably be easier. I'm not going to lie.
I don't know, man. I'm not putting a chip anywhere on my body.
Well, that would be the wise decision, yeah. But
Come on, join us.
there's gonna be a lot of motherfuckers lining up to get the eye chip, I think.
Yeah, you're going to be given the discount chip that you can actually afford, and they're going to be beaming ads directly into your brain that you can't look away from or like ignore.
That sounds like all kinds of fun. I'm just gonna switch to my laptop, so just give me a second.
All right. If anyone is in the audience, I see that a couple of newly joined audience members that want to throw your hand up and come up for a quick question or chat. I can. And it looks like we're not sure, but we do have a little bit of gossip that it does appear TJump may have responded. So we might get a celebrity visit from TJump. All right, so I'll pull up one of my questions while Piper gets ready there. Okay, I don't want to repeat anything here, so I'm just going to make sure I get a good one. What is the role of art and aesthetics in Hegelian philosophy, and how does it relate to his broader philosophical project?
Good question. That's something I've been very interested for a couple of years now. Actually, more than a couple of years, about 4. The role of art is to present freedom. Now, it's not like showing you like the typical propagandist things, like you would see like Liberty marching down the streets and, that famous painting of the French Revolution, or, the Statue of Liberty. That's not what he means. Freedom is self-determination. And self-determination is, depending on what you're depicting or, putting out in music, can be just about anything. Objects themselves self-determine to a certain extent, not just people. So that, the self-determination, the freedom that Hegel's talking about with art is the freedom of something which manifests a self-determination of any kind. So the most important kinds you might see historically in art is sort of cosmologies, mythologies of cosmology, in which the freedom that's being presented is the freedom of the self-determination of the world as a whole. So you have notions of fate, the gods, blah blah blah. That's the sort of thing that I would call like objective art, in the sense that it's presenting you a truth of what it is to be objective in the first place, what objectivity really is, and presenting it as such that it is the truth. In typical cosmologies, there's just an objective process of fate and generation and life and death, where things are just following a process, and you, the individual, are just stuck in the middle, and you got to deal with it. So, your life is ruled by these things. These are the kind of tragedies you see in Greek drama. Likewise, you get with music. Music, you can sort of the sense of beauty that you get with music and with visual art and with stories is, Hegel would say that the what explains that is this free unity of their conceptuality, such that when things come together of their own accord and make sense for themselves, we get a intuitive pleasure of this, and that this pleasure is the sort of resonance of freedom within us, even if we don't actually cognize it this way. We're not aware that we're seeing freedom, but the fact that we enjoy it this way is a sign of it. Something like music, it resonates more with subjectivity. As far as it goes, most people have a far stronger affinity for music than they do for visual arts, when it comes to like having a personal attachment. And the reason why Hegel says is that music is quite attuned to our subjectivity. That music is moving and the subject is itself moving as well. Music resonates more with our sense of personal subjective feeling and freedom. And that music is actually a very abstract thing, particularly music that's instrumental, pure instrumental music. So when you have something like that's beautiful, like a piece by Bach, part of what makes it beautiful is not just any specific moments or any abstract relationship moments, but like the actual generative unity of the whole thing, which not only just like, well, that felt nice, but on the deeper level, you know, you can start thinking about things and seeing that, you know, that the highs and the lows and the gaps between notes and all these other things can be interpreted to mean something. And, you know, with music, it's a very vague kind of meaning, so you can give it a lot of general leeway for interpretation. But there is an interpretation about real structures in there, which necessarily come together. And it seems that most great musicians have had this intuition as well, where they recognize that there's this kind of necessity in music that's very mathematical, and at the same time, it feels like the most free thing in the world. You know, nowadays, the main thing that dominates is, besides like, you know, pop music, is movies and shows and all these other things. And likewise, you see that a good show tends to have just a nice, when it's good, like what makes it good is that it doesn't feel forced, it doesn't feel formal. Like particularly with my experience, when I watch a show in which like I can see that the director or the writers just wanted something to happen no matter what, and they just contrived the whole situation to make it happen. And you're like, oh, come on, that's unrealistic. It's not that like, oh, it's unrealistic that because it doesn't happen in, you know, our physical reality. That's not what is meant. It's unrealistic in that it doesn't follow the logic of what was being set up in the first place. So, you know, you have somebody supposed to be a genius, and then suddenly for an episode, they're a complete moron because the author, you know, the writers and directors need some contrived situation to create a problem so that they can solve it and there can be a solution, and, you know, something can go on for the rest of the show. Those kinds of things are just come off as bad because they're just logically incoherent with what was placed at the beginning of the show to begin with, the beginning of the story. So, you know, when those things don't cohere, it's a sort of it's like making a bad argument, you know, where you're saying, you know, there's A, there's B, therefore C, and, you know, somewhere there's a logical leap or some kind of contradiction where it just doesn't make any sense with what's happening. So the purpose of art is for people to have their freedom expressed sensuously, as Hegel says. So, you know, we create art because not only it feels nice, I mean, that's the main reason, you know, we enjoy it, but the deeper meaning of that is that we enjoy it because on the far more meaningful level, particularly when you find a piece of art that really speaks to you, what speaks to you is far more meaningful than I just like it. It's usually some kind of personal relationship. And the best kind, I think, is not just a personal relationship of yourself to a piece, such that, you know, like this song reminds me of my parents or my dog or whatever, but rather that, you know, the piece itself has a meaning which you can objectively see in it, and which, you know, you can actually describe to somebody who doesn't immediately see it, and then they could see it as well too. So, you know, it's beyond just like, well, oh yeah, that's my favorite piece because my mother, you know, liked it, and I liked my mother. But, you know, this is my favorite piece because, you know, it has this sort of meaning. You know, it blah blah blah, and then so the person goes like, oh well, yeah, I don't feel it the way that you do, but I can see what you mean.
Great. Thanks for taking us down that very interesting road of explanation about how art and aesthetics figure into Hegelianism. We have been graced with the presence of TJump. Welcome. Nice
Hey.
to see you, and thanks for joining.
Absolutely. So I've had a number of conversations with people who study Hegel and are self-professed Hegelians, and they usually argue for things like the existence of God or consciousness being fundamental. So my first initial question is, what about Hegel's epistemology and ontology differs from that of classical modern science?
Well, first of all, I'd say that whoever says consciousness is fundamental for Hegel doesn't know Hegel. That's just completely wrong. Hegel makes it very clear that the ultimate thing is logos, not consciousness. There's a way in which consciousness plays a part in that, but it's not the primary fundamental. God is also not fundamental in the sense that God is not a presupposition, but a conclusion. And so, you know, Hegel's system, unless you understand God to be the system and not God, the representational being of, you know, religion, then it doesn't make, the representational being is not the fundamental one. It's God as the system is what is fundamental. And it's not even proper to say it's fundamental because it's not a foundation upon which there's something other. The foundation and what is founded co-constitute each other. So it doesn't really make sense to speak of it in these essential terms. This is why there's a difference between the concept and essence. As far as Hegel's epistemology ontology, technically speaking, Hegel does not see philosophy as working with epistemology and ontology. He sees it as working as pure conceptual reasoning, which does not have the problems of epistemology or ontology, because with epistemology, if you're asking, how do we know things, that already presupposes structures about what there is to be known in the first place, even if you don't explicitly do so. Implicitly, the very way in which you then go about knowing things already presupposes the structure of the objects which are to be known. Likewise, if you presuppose ontology, you're already presupposing a certain way in which they will be known, whether you posit it explicitly at the beginning or not. So in the Phenomenology of Spirit, that whole book is one gigantic reductio ad absurdum of epistemology and ontology at the same time, in which, with every chapter, we're shifting between epistemic positions, falling into ontological positions, falling back into epistemic conditions, and then seeing the whole thing as, well, this is actually something much more. There's something, not only there's something much more going on, there's something explicitly lacking here, which cannot be expressed in the positions that are being expressed. Such that at the end of the Phenomenology of Spirit, we get this whole thing of absolute knowing. And the absolute knowing is not an epistemic position, because in absolute knowing, the structure of consciousness is completely overcome. The natural consciousness is not there as what is driving anything anymore. What happens is absolute knowing is just the immediate position that in the entire phenomenology, what has been going on the entire time is that the knower and the known have actually been the exact same thing the entire time. The only thing that we've been knowing throughout the phenomenology is our own knowing. Every time we posit some kind of object out there, what's really being done is a projection of the structure of our own knowing. And when we look at the structure of our own knowing, what we're actually doing is a projection of the structure of the assumption of what an object is, such that when you get rid of that duality, what you get is something that is a self-constituting thing, but it's no longer a thing as a thing relating to consciousness out there, but it's a pure self-relationship of reasoning. So, at any point, quite literally, we have always known absolutely in the phenomenology. We just didn't know it. And once we know that we can't know in the structure of consciousness, and therefore the structures of epistemology where we have to deal with the conditions of subjectivity, once we get rid of that, the whole question just becomes, well, then what is reason? And that's what pure logic is.
So just to clarify, when you say logos is fundamental, but consciousness isn't, are you saying like the axioms of logic? Is that what he means by logos? And typically someone would say like to have axioms, you would need like a consciousness to think about them or something.
No, these aren't axioms. They're not like axioms of any consciousness. They're just self-reflexive determinations. I mean, it's like a self-iterative mathematical equation, except the mathematical equation itself is not even given. So it's constructed out of nothing.
So when you say constructed out of nothing, you're saying it exists as some rule in the universe or something?
The rule itself has to generate itself. That it generates itself is the factual given. You exist already, blah, blah, blah. But figuring out what that rule is has to do with just actually doing the generation activity itself, without already presupposing what the generative activity is, which is why he deals with the whole presuppositionalist issue.
And how do you go about doing that? Because my starting point is like epistemic solipsism. I think therefore I am. So the first thing I know is that I exist. What exactly is he saying exists?
He doesn't say anything exists. He says we're going to get rid of all categorical presuppositions. So we're going to get rid of assumptions and predispositions towards what we think is the case of anything, and what it even is to be a case, such that the only thing we're going to do is we're going to start with structures of the least assumption being just unrelatedness itself, immediacy. And we're going to think through this because, logic is thinking. That's at least the factual given. What thinking is and how thinking is a whole different issue, which is what we're not supposed to presuppose. So we're not going to presuppose it, or we're going to do it just because we can. So the issue is a meaning. It's more of a semantic in a way that, you're going to start with just like, okay, what is it to be in the first place? Well, we're not going to assume what being is. We're just going to give the structure of unrelated immediacy. Think that. You try to think it, you fail. There's a gap there between what is expected, even though you don't know what you're expecting, but you're expecting something. And the expectation that there would be something there and that there's a failure gives you a different kind of cognitive meaning towards leading you to nothing. Then you can stand back and see about this cognitive experience of failure to think, which it is, whatever it is, ultimately is, and you're stuck in this indeterminate loop between being nothing and back and forth, which then leads to a cycle of becoming. It's a very weird thing for somebody who thinks analytically, for example. Well, it's a very weird thing for anybody really in general. Continentals also can't make sense of it most of the time. But it's just a purely, I mean, if you want to put it in terms of semantics, that's probably the better framing. It's a purely semantic thing about what is meaning in the first place, such that through that we construct what reasoning really is.
And what is meaning in the first place?
Well, that's what you have to figure out. If you go with something that you're going to say, I'm going to not presuppose anything, it's unrelated. The meaning of that is, well, it's unrelated. If you try to think the unrelated, thinking is already trying to make relationship. You're going to be able to think nothing. This doesn't tell you what nothing is or that nothing is. It just tells you that this failure is what you call nothing. And then you stand back, you're like, well, this has a structure of immediacy again. Yeah, I've immediately done this, it immediately is there, which is just what being is. It's like constructing with Lego blocks. There's a certain kind of, these structures give you a very limited sphere of activity, what you can do with them. So in doing with them, what you do with them reveals what they are. And it's just back and forth of constructions.
You say unrelatedness. It seems like everything is necessarily going to be related in that it exists in reality, or it doesn't, or something along those lines. And
Well,
so,
that's
what
a
is unrelatedness?
presupposition. So it doesn't matter. Like it just, the whole point is that you're going to not presuppose what things are. Don't presuppose that things are. That's not even a presupposition. That's just a fact. You exist. You're thinking. To presupposition is simply don't put expectations as to what that is. So you're going to say, well, I'm going to think. Okay, well, what is the safest thing to think insofar as we're not going to get into trouble with, like maybe something snuck in behind there, or we're just going to think of something that's unrelated, the immediate as such. Well, what can I think with it? I can't. Therefore, nothing. Well, at least the nothing is immediately there, so it's immediate. It is. So it's the same thing as being. It goes right back, and you just have this back and forth. It's a
What do you
pretty
mean by
straightforward.
unrelatedness?
Unrelatedness. It's basic English. It has no relationships.
When you say you think of unrelatedness, how can you do that? Like, it's like thinking of nothing. I don't think it's even possible to do so.
Exactly. You can't.
So if you're supposed to think of unrelatedness, but you can't think of unrelatedness,
That's what
well,
nothing is.
it would be a contradiction. I don't think even nothing would be a contradiction.
Well, no, that's what nothing is. Like you're presupposing that nothing is something. Well, this is just saying this failure to cognize is what I'm going to call nothing.
And so failure to cognize is the fundamental, like, first starting point from Hegel?
No. There is no fundamental first starting point for Hegel. Like, the beginning at first is simply a pragmatic beginning of, well, if we're going to try to be good philosophers, we're going to assume nothing. We're going to, go with what at least seems to be the safest route of, the thing that's least assumptive, which is that which is unrelated.
What do you mean it has the least assumptions to think of something that's like nothing?
Well, it doesn't assume anything. I mean, like, I think you're getting caught up that you think that this is trying to think of something. It's not. It's just telling you a structure, and you're going to think the structure of unrelatedness, immediacy as such. There is no thing called being that you're trying to think. There is no thing called nothing that you're trying to think. You're taking these structures of cognition, going through them, and insofar as you notice any differences, you're giving it new names.
Okay, and so the point is that there just is nothing, and as you start of things, you're trying to assign connections between the things you're thinking of, but the initial starting point is the nothing.
Well, the initial starting point is just like unrelated immediateness. The meaning of that, if you think about the meaning, is just, well, obviously it's going to have no relationships. It can't be cognized. This failure to cognize, this failure to think is the next shift. It is different from the immediate immediacy, which, you have present as an object in cognition. So you call it nothing. And then from the nothing, you step back and you're like, okay, well, now it's back in presence of cognition again. It is what I don't know, but it just is. So I'm back to where I began, being nothing. And then this shift, you stand back from the whole system, but you can't escape because it's objectively the case that insofar as you have immediacy, you can't think it. And in not thinking it, and you think about not thinking it, which puts it back into the immediacy that it was. This shift of being to nothing is exactly what people call becoming. So you name it becoming because it's a pretty good word name for it. And you just keep constructing from there on.
So could any worldview start with the nothingness or the unrelatedness and essentially just build this exact same worldview without any difference by starting with that as the starting point?
Yeah, I mean, as far as Hegel is concerned, he thinks that insofar as we're cognizant of the same kind of categories together, we're going to necessarily be thinking these things, and they have to be in this order. There should not be a different order.
Could the categories be derivative or emergent from something more fundamental?
No, because something more fundamental itself is just a thought determination.
Why is that? So, like, why couldn't physicalism be true where there's like matter
Because
vibrating
you're presupposing reason, and that's the whole problem of the logic.
like ontologically, what would be the issue with that being the case?
Because you're presupposing reason. I mean, what sets up the distinction of the world and thought is thought itself, reason. If you say, well, there's something more fundamental than thought, well, how do you know that? That's a presupposition of reason. So how do you know reason has the validity? So, you have to know that reason has the validity to claim the truth. You can't just assume that reason has some problematic relationship to truth. Reason has to prove itself to itself. Then you could talk about the rest of the world.
So epistemically, I would agree we can't know that something else is fundamental. But I'm asking, would it be logically possible in some sense that something else was fundamental? Like, what is preventing it from being the case that physicalism is true? Because epistemically, we can start with Hegel's perspective. That wouldn't cause a problem, for example, for physicalism, because the fact that we can't know anything unless we think about it or label it or whatever doesn't actually cause anything to exist or not exist. And so the particles and
Well,
stuff.
no, but these are all presuppositions of reason. Like all of these things, physicalism is itself a presupposition of reason. You're going to say this is, I'm talking about the thing. Yeah, but the thing is a presupposition of your own reason. You're positing all this.
Yes.
You have to prove it. Ontology and epistemology are not separable in this way. Insofar as you're positing an ontology and say, oh, I'm just saying there's just things. Well, yeah, how? You're doing it through reason, or you want to go through some epistemic procedure. Either way, reason is the one that's positing these differences. How does reason have validity to state any such thing? You can't state things about epistemology or ontology, which do not then, get mediated by reason, such that reason is the place in which you have to prove these things ultimately.
Right, but wouldn't it be possible for reason to come about from something else?
Possibility is a determination of reason. I mean, that's what I'm saying. Like you're trying to get segue out of the way, but all these things are just presuppositions of reason.
Well, anything I say, any words that I use are going to be, but
no, it's not about words. It's the fact that you can cognize this is a presupposition of reason. If you say, well, what if there are things that are not cognized, but they exist? Who cares? You have to prove those things exist, and then, well, guess what? We cognize them.
Why do I have to prove those exist? Because the point is, if Hegel is right and he's saying that these rational things are the most fundamental thing, well, couldn't he just be wrong? And I want to know, I care if he's wrong.
Well,
And
how would
so-
you know that he's wrong unless you knew that reason was actually the one that validates all things? And then you'd have to have a true theory of true reason,
I
which would
wouldn't
have to
know,
be necessarily one-to-one with the ontology of your world.
I wouldn't know, but I don't want to know. That's not the interesting fact here. The fact here is, even if we don't know and could never know, couldn't it be the case that there is a reason is an emergent thing? It's not the most fundamental. It comes about from something else. And if so, would that make Hegel wrong? Was he making the claim that that was the case, or is he?
No, so you're misunderstanding reason as the human reason. That's not what reason is for Hegel. Reason is just determinability. If you say the planet Saturn, is so much miles radius, blah, 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 that's not a subjective thing for you. Sure, fine, the metrics is subjective. We use feet or kilometers, whatever. But the fact that there's an actual distance, between the center of Saturn and, its atmosphere is just a fact. But it's a determinable fact that is rationally inquirable. I mean, rationality is quite literally what it says, ratioing the relationship. Anything that would be determinable in any way whatsoever has to be rational because it has to have these differences internal to its relationship. That's all that reason is for Hegel. Reason is not this representation in your head. The fact that the representation in your head happens to have a capacity to become self-aware and self-determining and self-checking and self-validating just happens to be the perfect mirror of the kind of process that we would expect given an understanding of absoluteness, such that the world is one world. And if it's not one world, it's two worlds, and there are two worlds in one world, no matter how many times you want to split it. And therefore, the world has to generate itself, and therefore reason generating itself would have to match the absolute self-generation of the world. So you can't really, to say, well, there's something more fundamental to reason, just saying, well, there's a reason behind reason. Yeah?
Well, so it seems like you're saying that there is an object like a particle. For that particle to exist, there has to be some kind of rationale or reason to make it coherent or something. But to me, rationality, reason are languages like English. Like English didn't exist prior to, I don't know, whatever year it was invented. And that's totally fine because reality particles don't care about English. They're not governed by English. English is a descriptor of the things. And so why couldn't rationality be like that? It's just a language invented by humans to describe things. Why must it be this more fundamental essence kind of a thing that for an object to exist and that this rationality must exist with it?
Well, I mean, those are your presuppositions. I mean, you can have them, but in order for you to have a proof of that, you'd have to then have your own self-grounding and reason to prove that this is indeed the case and conceptually legitimate. Because otherwise, you can just conceive any concept that we want, presuppose so many things within it that we aren't even aware of, and have discussions in which we're going to go nowhere because, well, here's my presupposition, here's your presupposition, and we never really even talk about the same thing.
Well, I'm asking, why do you like those presuppositions? Anybody can have presuppositions, that's right. But is there any justification for it, or did you just arbitrarily say, I like these are my favorite ones? So if my position, just to clarify, if my position is equally as justified a presupposition as yours, then they're equivalent starting points, I would guess. But I'm asking, like, is there a reason why you would prioritize yours over mine? Is there some definitive factor that would say, oh, it couldn't be the physicalist way, it has to be the rationalist way because of argument or evidence or something, rather than it just being a presupposition?
Well, it seems to me that you're mixing up ontological and logical determinations here, which aren't the same thing. This is not a case of Hegel's not a rationalist in the sense that there is some kind of disembodied mind or whatever. There is no opposition of materialism to this idealism. They're not opposites at all. All idealism means is determinacy, particularly determinacy in obviously a rational whole. Rationality being just literally relationality. Insofar as you can relate anything you have rationality. That's why I give the example of Saturn. So physicalism is itself a determination of idealism, in this case, as Hegel means it. So that's a false dichotomy. As for the reason why, well, the reason why is that Hegel can prove the self-rationality of reason as self-generative, absolutely. So there's no runaway of, well, there's always a further reason that I can never account for. Now, whether you want to buy that is a whole different thing. But there is a whole huge argument in the science of logic to prove this. And it cannot be proven in this, simple abstractions of propositions of, oh, well, if I give you A, B, and C, and therefore, D. I wish it was that easy, but it totally isn't. So you'd have to go see for yourself, whether you found this project to be leading somewhere that you found interesting, so that you would commit to actually going through it. Otherwise, it's just it's a hard thing to sell.
You said that physicalism and Hegelian idealism aren't mutually exclusive. That part I got lost on a little bit. So, because it seems like physicalism entails quantum fields are the most fundamental things, and all rationality is like English. It doesn't exist. It's just a human construct of the brain and nothing more. Whereas it seems like the Hegelian perspective is that rationality is more fundamental part of reality, kind of a thing. It's not just a language we made up in our brains. It's actually something more significant than that. And so that would seem like a contradiction.
No, because if you look at quantum fields, they're rational. They're determinable. You're seeing relationships there.
Sure. But the rationality doesn't exist in physics. It's just a
Well,
descriptor.
no,
so it's like language.
it's not a descriptor. Like the relationships are there.
I'm
That's
not
just a
sure.
fact.
Yes, but the relationships
there's the atomic nucleus. There are the electrons. The relationship is there. That's just a fact.
Yes, it's a fact that is because
Exactly.
of the physics.
So, and that's exactly why I say rationality for Hegel is just determinability.
Well,
The fact that there is
relationships in
determinability
physics, the relationships in physics are physical facts. It's because it has this physical nature that it has a relationship.
Right.
Relationships
There's
aren't
nothing
fundamental.
wrong with rationality being physical. Determinability of all kinds is rational. That's just all it is.
Well, the determinability in physics is completely secondary. Like even if something is never determinable.
No, the fact that it is determinable is rational. If it's not determinable, then who cares? You're speaking about nothing.
Well, no, like there's in quantum mechanics, there's the position that randomness is fundamental. There's actually a randomness force which is undeterminable, and that it's impossible to know the momentum and whatever.
Sure, I know what you're talking about. Yeah, but that indeterminability itself is determinable. That's why we have field equations to begin with, and they work perfectly fine. So any determinability at all is rational. That's all that idealism means. It's not this opposition between physical and mental. That's not it. It's just determinability as such.
I don't see what the importance of determinability is here. Why even use the word? Why just say physics? Don't just say like there isn't determinability. Say there is physical particles, physical energy.
Because physics is itself a determinable relationship between the non-physical and the physical. So
Sure, but it's just
physics is clearly not fundamental because it still has a relationship, which is a rational relationship. It's not what is built on, but itself is built up from. Below field equations, we still have notions of causality. We still have notions of what it is to be an object. We still have notions of conceptuality. We still have notions of essentialities. These are just structures of any object whatsoever, physical or mental, of any kind. And you can't take atoms and electrons and build those things out of those. That doesn't mean anything. It's those things which are conceptually built off lower elements,
Yeah, I see it the other way. I see it that rationality, delineations, those are all built by particles, physics.
Well,
I think that's the consensus among physicists.
You can't build cause and effect from atoms.
Sure you can. Why not?
No, you can't.
Why not?
Prove it.
Well, you're presupposing you can't.
Well, I know you can't. But
Based
you know,
on what?
we're just gonna get into a whole like my presuppositions versus your presuppositions. Insofar as we're having this discussion in abstraction, what I'm presenting is indeed presuppositional in that presupposes my positions. So we're just gonna get nowhere with that. I suppose that's kind of the end of that train of thought.
Well, it's the point is that in physics, everything is made of physical stuff. The relations are all subservient to the physical stuff. It's all particles all the way down, essentially.
Right,
And
right.
that
And my
seems to
point
be a
is that
hard.
those things, and my point is that those things are themselves determinable by other things. You can't determine those things without having a determination of objectivity, of essentiality, relationships of identity, of difference, of ground and grounded. These things already go before you even get to a physical objects. So, logically speaking, it's a no-go. It's just blatantly false that, those concepts are built from those things. That doesn't even make any sense. It makes sense if you don't think about it. But if you try to conceptually explain what is going on, those come before. You can't explain field equations without a concept of objectivity. I mean, this is a very basic Kantian thing.
Right, but I can explain objectivity as a concept in the brain.
Right, but the brain
So-
is itself a concept determined by your aspect of reasoning. So you still have to explain reasoning as to why reasoning has any validity whatsoever.
Right. So it seems like, my perspective, what you're saying is that if we can label something or imagine something, then that thing has this quality of rationality to it, and therefore the rationality must be basic to all things that can be imagined. To me, that seems no different than saying, well, I can label something with a word, therefore words must be fundamental to all things. And
No,
clearly
I'm
that's
just saying
false.
that anything determinable, it's not about my labels, it's the fact that things are determinable at all. You don't
How's
have
that
to
different from
label a
my word
triangle
example?
triangle. Well, no, you don't have to label a triangle, for example. The triangle has objective properties that whatever you want to say about it, it's going to have those no matter what. On a 2D plane, a triangle has 180 degrees some angles. You can subdivide any triangle into a right triangle, which, is subject to the dynamics of the Pythagorean equations for the hypotenuse. That's just a fact, consequent to the construction itself. That's not my subjective labeling. That is what a triangle is. You can call it whatever. You can give it any name. That's not the problem. The problem is that a certain determination is a certain relation, and a certain relation has a specific consequence. You can only stick the Lego blocks together in so many ways, objectively. You can believe anything else you want, but objectively, you can only stick them together in one certain way.
I would agree, but I'd say that's because of the fields of physics, not because of relations, but that's because of the fields of physics. And relations,
Which are relations. I mean, like we're getting into linguistic things here. It seems that
well, this is the
perhaps
part that I
the whole
disagree with. Like,
barrier.
they are not relations. They are not relations. Relations are the things we add to them. We say they relation things, but no, those don't exist. Those are words we make up. They are physics. They are fields, and relations don't come until after the fields. The fact that I can label it a relation doesn't make it somehow
That's not a
fundamental. any more
label.
than
I mean, like a field is already a relationship.
it's a label, which is, yes, in our
No, it's not a
language,
label. A field, okay, if you define a field, the field already is relational.
that's because we've defined it. That's a word. We've given
No,
it
it's
a
not
label.
defined it. It is relational.
I'm not
You
sure
can't have a
what you're
field that
saying.
isn't related. So
Right, but that's like you say, you can't have an object that you can't describe with a word. Relatedness here is
no,
just that
okay,
we
see, hold
compare
on.
it.
Can you please stop doing that? I've already told you multiple times. My position is not to do with words. So please stop projecting that position on me.
Well, no, I'm
I
not
mean,
projecting.
otherwise
That's
we're
the
going
question.
nowhere.
The question is from my perspective, I see no difference between your position on relations and my analogy with words. I'm not accusing you of this. I'm trying to figure out why yours isn't this, because as far as I can tell, I can't see any substantive difference between the two.
Because the descriptions being given are of the relationships themselves. It's not like definition first and then go look for it. No. These are actual relationships already enacted, which your language is merely being used pragmatically to track. The language is not the source of meaning, it's the thing itself.
Right, I understand what you're saying there, but that's why I brought up the initial example of asking, can an object exist prior to rationality and rationality be emergent from that thing or whatever? And you didn't really give a no there.
No, I did answer. I said, you're mistaking rationality to be this representation in my mind. That's not what rationality is. Rationality is determinability.
How is that not a relationship in your mind?
Because Saturn has the radius it has, whether I think about it or not. That's just the determinable fact of how it is.
I
It has a
just
certain
leave out.
positionality within. It has a certain positionality in the solar system. It has a certain positionality in relationship to its moons. Whether I give it a number, whether I give it a name, has nothing to do with it. That's just the existential fact. Now, it seems that you just have a problem with that. The word relational brings up connotations for you that doesn't bring up for me.
Yeah,
Well, sort of.
TJump,
I just
comment that a field is just as much of a label as relational. And how do you respond to the allegation that you're pulling a sort of greedy nominalist?
where was that?
Well, basically, it sounds like they're
Right,
saying that you're
Uh,
both special pleading your own positions.
Well,
yeah,
I'm not arguing for a position here. I'm just asking questions. I'm not specifically saying there is
yes,
one
sir. I
truth.
just wanted to clarify my statement. So what I meant to say was, if we're going to say, oh, relationality, we came up with that. That's a concept we have. We just apply that to what is. That supervenes on the fundamental. Well, then it seems to me if you introduce some category like particle or field or atom, it's just the same thing all over again. That's also a category we came up with, right? The question is not what is the content of these categories, but in fact, do these categories carve nature of the joints? And merely presupposing my categories do and yours don't, well, that's just kind of greedy in a dialectical sense, right? That's just kind of not taking my interlocutor's position seriously. So yeah, that's what I mean. Like, why should I? Let's say I'm just a pure skeptical nominalist. Why should I take fields or particles any more seriously than God or the soul or relationality?
Well, that's kind of exactly my point, is that if you're assuming rationality is the basic thing, and I can propose this alternative that particles are the basic thing, why are you excluding that? That's the question. And the fact that you can label it, or that you have some relation that you think can be applied to describe that thing, okay, but that doesn't mean that it's not, that the relation must pre-exist to the particle. So that's the whole point, is that it seems like the Hegelian position is presupposing its own ontology, that rationality is basic because you can describe things with rationality. And I'm like, well, is there another reason somewhere?
Do you understand that what AW is describing in Hegel is not some kind of mythical realist position about the fundamental nature of the world?
No, I don't understand that.
Yeah, that's going to be the problem, right? What he's trying to explain, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, but what he's trying to explain is that the way that rationality for Hegel, right, is going to be quote unquote fundamental, right, is that we're only going to know, according to Hegel, about the world, right, through the picture that we construct of it in investigating the object of experience, right?
That's epistemic solipsism. So epistemology, I can.
No,
I'm
it's
fine with
not
that.
epistemic solipsism. It's called constructivism.
Epistemic solipsism. So you think and
No,
you
it's
learn from the
constructivism.
thinking.
That's
You
not what I
saying it
said.
again doesn't make you right on this one. So
Well,
I
all you
understand
did was say it again.
epistemology. I did epistemology.
No, you don't understand epistemology.
All right, that seems to be kind of an irrelevant debate, quite frankly.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah, you weren't too far off, Piper. I mean, yeah, it is constructivist, but it's not merely constructivist. There is an objectivity to it.
I agree.
Yeah, I just think we're probably having a linguistic missing each other's points here, I suppose. We're just speaking a very different set of languages.
Yeah, that could be.
Although,
Yeah, sorry.
I mean, although if I can answer then to the specific thing about like presupposing relationality, no, you don't have to presuppose. As a matter of fact, that's what exactly the being nothing thing is for. I try to think the unrelated, and yet I find I have the relationship to the being and nothing. The expectation of the immediacy which is and the immediacy which is not. And from this, relationships just happen to necessarily arise. Insofar as the thing is in itself, what is in itself is just simply not being another, and this itself then posits relationality necessarily. And likewise in relationality, you need the immediacies which are unrelated. That insofar as you have relationships or being for others, Hegel calls it, you need to have the being in itself. You need to have the immediacy which is unrelated to the other. But the unrelatedness is it's already posited in being unrelated as not being that which is the relationship, which relates it to the relationship. These are conceptual riddles of sorts, dialectics, as he calls them, in which positing these categories is going to lead you into a whole issue in which the metaphysics of atomism, so to say, and the metaphysics of pure relationality, like something like Buddhist emptiness, are two sides of the exact same coin. They're not independent of each other. They can't be stated independently. They come together, and that's where something like determination would be the solution for Hegel, where determination is that which has both immediate being in itself, but also the immediacy of relationship, which is in itself. So it is an independent in itself, but it's also relational at the same time, necessarily. It is contradictory, but that's how it is.
So you said Buddhism and materialism can be conjoined through the dialectic. And why would you want to do that? Like, why wouldn't you want to say they are different things and one is potentially more accurate than the other?
Well, it's not why you would want to do that, but that would presuppose that you're trying to construct an argument towards something. Hegel's not constructing an argument towards anything. He's just saying the way things are coming together.
What does he mean by coming together here? So, like, they're coming together in that you can both use rationality or words to describe them, and they're coming together in what sense?
Coming together of their own account. It's like the thing, like with being and nothing. I don't know how I can set it more simply, or the being in itself. But insofar as you have a being in itself, the understanding is that it's not another. In order to say this thing's independent, it's independent from a dependency. That's just logically what's happening. You can't make sense of this without having that other meaning entailed in it. There's a way to see this in which like all the meaning is literally just a negation of that other meaning. And so the other meaning is what grounds it. So you go from like that which is immediately just self-contained to that which in which it's a relationship, at least to the unrelationship. And then itself points right back to the things which are supposed to be unrelated. Because you can't have relationships without things which are unrelated to begin with, which have an independent being. So you have the independent atom and you have the relationships tied together just necessarily. The very meaning of them, to think about them, requires it. And this is not some kind of new insight. Quite frankly, plenty of people in history have discovered this. Someone like Nagarjuna discovered this, for example. A lot of the Hindu logicists, logicians discovered this. As a matter of fact, that's why they were skeptical about reason. This is why people thought that there was something more fundamental than reason. They're like, well, reason can't make sense of of the world because reason has these contradictions. They don't even make sense to reason itself, and they're just necessary. You can't escape them.
Oh, so there is something more fundamental than reason?
No, I'm saying that they had the reason to think there was something more fundamental reason because they saw these contradictions. And so they thought, well, reason seems to be hamstrung here. You reach these limits in which, reason doesn't make any sense anymore because it's literally staying a contradiction.
Do you disagree? You say that the contradiction is okay?
Yeah.
Is there an advantage or something we can do if we adopt this ideology that we wouldn't be able to do under a different ideology?
You can make more sense of things. I mean, like I said, in abstraction, all this stuff doesn't really seem to make any sense. And I myself actually profess this to people who want to learn about this, and they're like, I want to learn about this because I think I'm going to do something with this. To which I respond, you're not going to do anything with this. There's no way to think dialectically about cooking your breakfast or running your organization or teaching your kids. You do that with regular old thinking. You don't need philosophical thinking for this kind of thing. This kind of thinking is specifically only to consider pure categories, nothing else.
And which categories does it make more sense of than science or classical philosophy?
Well, science doesn't make sense of categories, so that's sort of nonsense. Insofar as it makes sense of stuff in classical philosophy, it makes sense about them in the same way they did. It just goes and shows that they are necessary connections, which were not considered by many people. There were some people who did consider them, and which you can show that this is just the necessary structure of these concepts. And people who looked at it and said like, oh well, there's a contradiction here, and therefore there stops the buck. We give up on reason. Hegel says, well, we don't have to. Why would we? Sure, the thing shows up to be self-contradictory in that it turns into its opposite, or entails its opposite, or is immediately self-inverting at the same time with its opposite. Why is that a problem? We can keep thinking. There is no issue. The fact that you notice that being and nothing, are stuck within a loop, turning into each other, doesn't mean anything. We can think further, because then we can say, well, we know that this actually does make sense. We have a concept for it, becoming. And then becoming itself has ceasing to be and coming to be. And those itself lock up into a different determination of existence. And existence itself also has been to lock up within determinacy and quality of reality and negation. Where in order to be real, you have to be distinct from the negation, and therefore you negate the negation. Therefore, you're actually just nothing but negations. But the negation itself stands its own relationship to itself as the negation of the reality, which is its negation. Therefore, it itself is real. And you get that out of that. The whole system is what something is. It's a qualified thing or a qualified quality in a way. The whole thing couldn't keep constructing. There is no problem. So, for Hegel, it's like, well, contradiction is a big, so what? Yes, there is a contradiction, and so what? It doesn't stop us from thinking. We can still keep thinking. So we do.
So is he saying there are literally P and not P kind of contradictions, true contradictions?
Not of that formal kind, no. Like, insofar as A is A really is A. But logically entailed that is also the non-A, to which the A as identity is being distinguished. So, in the very fact that you say A equals A, there's a distinction. You're using difference to loop back and re-identify A with A in the proposition of A equals A. Somebody might then go and say, really, difference is really the fundamental thing. It's not actually identity. But then in order to get the identities, you also need, in order to get the difference, you need the identities which separate. So these are contradictions, but there's no problem with that. If you specify that in this moment, this thing is in this identity moment, that's perfectly fine. In another moment, it's in the difference moment, and that's perfectly fine. And you'll get positions in which both things will happen at the same time, like becoming. Becoming is both being and nothing at the same time to the same extent. It's not more being or more nothing. It's both being and nothing at the same time to the full extent. So, that's a contradiction in the sense of, P and not P, I suppose.
So does that mean there are or not true contradictions? I'm lost.
Depending on what you mean, yes, but also no. Because from one side of the process, a thing can be contradictory, but from another side, it's perfectly reasonable. If you just think the dialectic of being and nothing, from within, there's no problem. You think the immediate, you fail to think. You think about your failure to think, and you're back to thinking, or back to thought, really. From within, it's just one sequence of events, which there's no problem. You're just thinking through it, thinking about it, thinking through it again. It's only from standing back as a whole that you see, oh, well, it's actually both these things at once. Then it's contradictory.
Do we want that in a system? Wouldn't we prefer one that doesn't have any contradictions?
Why wouldn't you? I mean, like Hegel's whole thing is like, well, people just presuppose that there's something wrong with contradiction, but we can work with it perfectly fine. And it's just true. Like the structure of immediacy leads to an incapacity to draw anything out of it, which itself leads to the absence of the thing itself, which is a nothing. That's just the conceptual fact, if you want to call it. So it's not like whether I want it. It's not whether I want it or not. It's just the case. So you're going to deal with it.
Because you said that the benefit of adopting this ideology is that it makes sense of things or helps people understand things. And it seems like a system that adopts contradictions does the opposite of that. It makes it harder to make sense of things and harder to understand things. And so if we're looking for an ideology that does help people to understand things better, one with contradictions seems to be counterproductive towards that goal.
Well, I can see why you would think that from the outside, but if you actually went through this, it's perfectly reasonable. It makes more sense than anything I have ever encountered. Most of the things that I read nowadays, which tends to be usually ancient philosophy and just German idealist stuff for the most part, occasionally some other people, it's the same things. Whenever people are thinking truly, they cannot help it. Like they literally cannot help it no matter how they try. They arrive at these same exact contradictions because it's just what they really are. You can couch your definitions however you like, and people have tried to death. You have the fundamental problems of skepticism, which skepticism always pulls up, of the self-contradictions of the fundamental positions of philosophy. So you got to deal with it, whether you like it or not. The fact that you bury your head and just eschew the issue and pretend like a lot of people said, well, I'm just going to grab this horn of skepticism and go with it, as if that's the solution, which it's not. It's just turning a blind eye to the whole issue. Well, sure, if you want to ignore the issue, can't stop you, but if you actually want to solve the philosophical riddles, you got to deal with it.
Well, that's one of the reasons why I like the particle physics model, because particles don't have contradictions. We can have our language and our rationality can have contradictions in ways that we describe reality, but reality doesn't have any contradictions if it's just particles. And so I think that is a more parsimonious way to address reality in a way that makes sense without the contradictions.
Well, there's plenty of contradictions with particles. The whole being and nothing, the whole being in itself being for other, they are related. There's no atomism without relationships. As much as you want to think that there is, you're not really thinking if you think that there is. I mean, like quantum mechanics is full of a bunch of nonsense, quite frankly, like quantum superpositions and all that jazz. I mean, if anything, I would think that somebody who believes in modern physics would be quite comfortable with contradictions because most of it is contradictions. Of the bad kind, quite frankly.
All right, that's it for my questions.
Thank you so much, TJump. It was awesome to hear from you. I hope this was as awesome and entertaining for you as it was for me. Looking forward to the next one. AW has.
Thank you for the information. Yeah. Thank you for the invitation. This was an enjoyable chat.
How are you doing? Are you able to still take some questions?
Sure, yeah.
Hello.
Go ahead. Thanks for joining, Ian. Please mute. We've had Piper who's been patiently waiting for quite some time. Please go ahead with your question.
Yeah, so I mean, I have a few questions that I could ask, but the question that I think is most important to ask is related to the fact that on your blog you've been writing about Eastern the East and Eastern philosophy, as I take it, from a Hegelian perspective. And I was really interested when I saw that because, of course, um, there's this unfortunate fact about Hegel that he disregards the East. And so I guess I'll kind of roll a couple questions into one. One, do you think that what do you think is like the biggest takeaway from the biggest takeaway for Hegelians related to Eastern philosophy? Right? What's the most kind of important um, takeaway from Eastern philosophy for Hegelians? And then, um, were you inspired by any kind of Hegelian scholarship trying to bridge the gap between Hegel and the East, or have you kind of come upon that kind of project on your own?
Yeah, to answer the what can a Hegelian take from Eastern philosophy, it's pretty damn close. Particularly once you get to the late Chinese philosophy of Neo-Confucianism, or well, I prefer to call it Dao Shui because it's more to the spirit of what it is. Um, it's a synthesis of all the traditions of philosophy in China under the umbrella of Confucianism. And it's the most Chinese of them all, in that China has always been a place obsessed with ethics, ethical substantiality, concreteness. And so Neo-Confucianism is a place where you get the link between Taoist metaphysics to the concrete level of social life. Also, you get some links towards some Buddhist psychological stuff, and as well as metaphysical stuff, particularly with substance and function. If you think about things, I don't even know if it's not even proper to say it's in a Hegelian way, because thought functions the same way across thinkers once you figure out how to think conceptually. Thinking conceptually is not like thinking with propositions as modern analytics do, quite frankly. It's more about thinking with structures, analogies, metaphors. This does not thereby mean that there is some kind of lack of rigor. There isn't. As a matter of fact, I find this stuff to be far more rigorous than anything analytic I've ever read. Because the links are so much stronger in the arguments, and they're not simply propositional, formal arguments. They're arguments about content, such that certain contents give rise to certain syllogisms, and certain syllogisms give rise to certain contents. The form and the content are tied together. So I think what I find most fascinating is that Dao Shui, which is the learning of the way, is probably the most intuitive form of Hegelianism I have found. Yes, if you're not familiar with that kind of thinking, which, I mean, if you have trouble reading somebody like Lao Tzu, you have trouble reading somebody like Heraclitus, and you have trouble reading like somebody like Heraclitus, you probably have trouble with some of Plato's dialogues as well, because similar things happen about inversions. But if you're comfortable with that and just like you're very good at just following a concept along, even if you don't realize that it's going to be a contradiction in the end, a lot of the Dao Shui just comes very naturally to some very strong conclusions, which are true. They're not argued to the same specificity and strength that someone like Hegel would in his philosophy of right, but pretty darn close. The way they justify a lot of this stuff about tradition, for example, is actually very metaphysically grounded, such that you can see how the metaphysics leads to that kind of view necessarily. And a lot of the metaphysics is just simply concretely grounded. I mean, they were highly observant and interested in the patterns of animals, the patterns of the seasons, the cycles of things. And they looked at everything within processes of relationalities and totalities. So I don't know that a Hegelian would learn anything new. I mean, I don't think that I have, but it gave me an appreciation for Chinese thought, which I did not have before. I frankly hold it above Indian philosophy. But my knowledge of Indian philosophy is now comparatively shallower than my knowledge of Chinese philosophy. So I'm not giving a final judgment there, but I certainly find myself far more attracted to Chinese philosophy in the way that it proceeds. As a matter of fact, Indian philosophy strikes me as far more analytic, and it surprises me that analytics don't tend to be aware or like Indian philosophy very much, despite that a lot of their modern interests are actually quite strongly presaged in far earlier Indian thinkers. A lot of the epistemical stuff, but a lot of the ontological issues, very propositionally minded, not very conceptually minded for the most part, although there's plenty of that are conceptually minded. China's rising. It's good to know the Chinese worldview. And believe it or not, learning that entire history of philosophy made me well aware that despite all the Chinese communist attempts at getting rid of this backwards culture that they so-called back in during the Mao era, it's all still there, and it's all back. It's not gone. They call it Marxism, they could call it whatever they want. The same metaphysical assumptions, the same logics of relationality and activities still dominate Chinese intellectual thought, no matter what kind. So it gives you an insight into how China as a state and society operates today and will operate in the future, most likely. As for my interest just came out of, I mentioned this earlier because Jen asked, came out of realizing that I was ignorant of China, and because China is a rising power, it's probably pertinent to start learning a bit about what they think, just as how the rest of the world for the last 100 years has found it pertinent to understand what we think.
Thank you. That was a very edifying answer. I appreciate it.
Mhm.
Did you have a follow up, or can I keep going?
Well, yeah, I think 2 questions from me should be enough. You can go on somebody else.
Jordan, I saw you unmuted before. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I just had a question as related to your conversation with TJump before. When you say like the category or like the contradictions are necessary, are you getting this from like how Kant had like the antinomies of reason, that he thought that like no matter which way you put it, there's going to be like a contradiction that's going to be coming up no matter what you do. Like the example he might give is that like in some way that if you try to deduce what is the beginning of time, you'll be led to think it's infinite and also finite at the same time. So in that way, it's contradictory. Do you think that that's like necessary within the stage of like any sort of reasoning for Hegel? And that's why you got it, or am I mistaken how you arrived at that process?
No, that's like Kant's dialectics are not at all like Hegel's. Kant is just simply following what was already known about certain contradictions from Sextus Empiricus, in which actually even before that it was well known with the sophists in Greece. That was their mode of operation. They could argue both sides equally whenever it came to particularly metaphysics. And the reason it worked was precisely because these categories are so fundamental that they're tied both to each other, and that wasn't what people realized, but they realized that they seemed opposite, and you could argue for them equally. There was good reason for both of them. Kant does not think that this is some kind of inherent contradiction to reason. He just thinks about the undecidability of these positions, towards which he provides a solution by splitting them into noumenal and phenomenal sides, so that on the noumenal sense, the world is eternal, but on the phenomenal sense, it's finite. Hegel's contradictions are much different. It's just like the contradictions are just simply like the oppositions or determinations of a triangle, where if you have 2 angles and one side, the whole triangle is now determined because you determine the other 2 sides, and within that you determine the third angle And then within that, if you need specific distance relationships by splitting from the vertical down the middle, you can split it into a right triangle, which always will have, the a squared plus b squared equals c squared, no matter what triangle it is.
So,
Those kinds of relationships are just inherent to the initial determination.
oh, I see. In that way, Hegel doesn't have to make that like phenomenal numinal divide. He could just say it's inherent within the object, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I see. And my other question is that does Hegel believe in the same sort of like transcendental categories that Kant believes, like, relation and modality and quality, for instance, that are needed for experience to get knowledge of things a priori, synthetic a priori, actually.
No, it doesn't. Concepts are all metaphysical. So it's not about my mind, it's about just what an object as such is.
I see. So then you don't need the categories because, you know, I guess it would just be kind of like limiting it to yourself. You propose them or something, right?
Yeah, you don't have to presuppose the categories at all. Things reveal their own determinations on their own account.
I think I'm confused 'cause I don't understand them well enough, but like, couldn't you have things like that exist in themselves? Like Aristotle thought, like, he didn't make a phenomenal numinal did not divide or anything. Um, and yet he still had his famous categories that existed, right? Like, couldn't he do something, Hegel do something like that? Like, um, in trying to divide up objects.
Well, no, because anything that's in itself is already negatively related as to that which is externally relational. Otherwise, you'd only have one in itself, and it would just be self-related. Either way, relationships arise. uh, so you don't really need you don't need to presuppose the categories, and you don't have any. There's no valid notion of, well, what if I could conceive a thing that's just perfectly self-related and independent and just never relates to us in the world? Well, okay, you're positing a possibility. Who cares?
Yeah, oh, I see. Then that way it would be kind of like useless, I guess, to have those categories in place because they're just dividing things up that aren't demonstrated at all.
Yeah.
I see. Yeah, that was my only questions. Thank you.
Hey, Maximo, thanks for joining. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I had a question for AW. I want to know how would Hegelianism answer the problem of the criterion? So it goes somewhat like, what do we know? How do we know? What is a criterion for deciding what knowledge is, and why use that one over any other one?
All right. Well, that's what the phenomenology of spirit answers. There's two ways to go about it, actually. You can be charitable to the person who's asking that and just go with their assumptions, which is what the phenomenology does. Which is, okay, fine. I'm not going to put forth what is true and what is not, or how to get truth. You tell me. And so somebody says, like, well, truth is, sense certainty is what immediately is before me, and before the senses, and that's how I know. And then you can just look at that structure and think about it, and see that in that there are relationships. It's not as immediate as it claims to be. It claims that it's making no judgments, no universal things are involved, but universal aspects are involved in the sense of categories are being employed of this, here, now. Relationships are being employed in the very determination of the this, because the this is not another this. Each now is not another now. Each here is not another here. The way you specify here, each precisely in relationship or negative relationship to another here. So this position of immediacy turns out to be not immediate, and so fine, okay. Then you have the aspect of the universality of language with the individuality or particularity of sensuality, and these two don't cohere, and language can't specify that individuality, so you can't really say even to yourself, what it is that you're specifying. Even if you just erase language, you just point things out, the same thing happens. You're pointing as pointing doesn't mean any specific thing. All things are pointed to, so you can't pick out. So from that, Hegel moves on to perception. In perception, you have sensuous universals, the unity of a universality which brings together sensuous particularities like qualities on a substrate. And again, you have these issues of, do we really have a thing, or do we just have the quality, properties? Because if we have the thing, the only way we know the thing is because of the qualities, the properties which are appended to it. And then we go and investigate the things. Well, the properties. The properties themselves are constituted in a way that either relate each other negatively through some kind of divisor, like the substance, or if you take them to be independent things themselves, they themselves turn out to be in the exact same structure of substances. So you have substance and properties following into each other, so you can't ground properties and substance, no substance and properties. All of these things is simply the case that even if you don't posit a criterion, you have a self-corrective mechanism in which if you just think about things, your own reason notices contradictions and absences and gaps of explanation. So even if you don't know what the proper meaning of knowing is, you're still able to act and at least judge, even if you don't even know by what metric you have a right to judge. Even if you just take somebody else's metric, you can judge through that and see its own failure on its own ground. The ultimate justification for this is, in the end, this absolute knowing of a knowing that knows itself, in which is constantly determining itself. The procedure of determination is not discovered in the phenomenology of spirit, it's discovered in the science of logic, where we do explicitly build up to the notions of a self-conceptualization in which we find out what it means to even be true, and therefore what the check of reason really is, which is a self-correspondence, and what does it mean to self-correspond as a concept to an object, or really ultimately a concept to a concept. Because the concept is simply just the subjective side or the active side of an object in its making or its being, and then the object is simply that concept, being sort of like something that spins so fast that it seems solid. That's what objectivity ultimately is, and because the concept self-encloses and deals only with itself, anything that would relate to it from outside wouldn't penetrate into it, and therefore you have these relationships of mechanism, chemism, teleology, and all that jazz. So the answer to how do we deal with the problem of the criterion is don't assume a criterion and just think.
Maximo, you're muted, but did you want to pose any follow-ups?
Yeah, sorry. So I interpreted this as like two answers to this. So one, you first said too that like the criterion changes over time as we go through a process of like self-reflection. But then you said at the end that we just don't have a criterion anyways.
Yeah. I mean, insofar as you posit a criterion,
Right.
reason is going to lead you to check on it, even if you don't fully understand why. You still have that check, and what it would mean for the criterion to ultimately be true is that it could survive this check.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're saying for like this criterion kind of like does a self-evaluation, and when it fails to live up to its standards, it moves on to a higher form.
Yeah. Because usually the usual sense is like, oh well, this failed, and it's not that you suddenly make something completely new up without taking into account just what happened and what went wrong. But you do look for a new conception that takes into account what went wrong and can find it and can make sense of it. Just like how.
Sure. Yeah. So
with-
my question would be like
with
then.
quantum-
Oh, go on.
Yeah, I was going to give you for the example of quantum mechanics. The new conception of reality for physics came about because there were problems with classical mechanics. So the new conception, the new criterion of what is true, built off of what we found to be the failures of classical mechanics. So we realized that criterion was wrong. So we put a new criterion that doesn't have those flaws, and we just keep reiterating. At least in empirical science, we keep reiterating on that. But philosophically, what happens is not only are we just substituting something else that doesn't have the problems, but in not having the problems, it happens to usually be also containing and making sense of the relationships that couldn't be made sense of in the prior one. And therefore, the rationality of the process is increasing.
So you're saying like the new criterion encapsulates all the truth of the old one.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So again, I guess what I would ask is this: does this process ever stop, or do you think it's infinitely eternal?
For empirical things, probably not. I mean, there might be a case in which I think we'll keep finding out new things about physics probably forever. I don't see why not. But philosophically, there's many things in which there is a clear end. As far as like the structures of metaphysics, there is, as far as I can tell, not going to be any further developments. You're not going to find some kind of new modality, for example. You're not going to find any form of substantiality. Like most forms of essentiality are already themselves just repetitions of the basic concept of essence to begin with. So a lot of it is empty repetition.
I'm not quite sure. So I'm not quite sure I understood that. Like, are you saying we'll just make an exhaustive list of all the categories that we need to think through any such case of knowledge or truth? So we get to like the state of like
on the structure of objects. Yeah, on the
right, so
structure
like
of objects.
okay, yeah. So do you think we'll get to like the state of absolute certainty of any knowledge claim?
Yeah, we can have absolute certainty on the structure of objects. On any specific
Okay.
object, there might be, like, for example, before the internet existed, probably 100 years prior, nobody had any notion that what the internet would be. But how the internet has played out is a specific instantiation of how a lot of organic logics play out. So, is it a new instantiation? Yes. But is it like something that's radically, categorically new? No, not really. It's just like how, if you have animals, most animals share a DNA base. There are specifications, but the general way that animals function, that they have some level of consciousness for the most part. They have to have some kind of mobile control, motor controls. They have appetites. They have to feed in some way, whether by sunlight or by eating other things. Those basic logics don't change, and those are very finite and final.
Okay.
Small has
So
do you have anything else to say? I see we've been joined by pessimistic idealism. Thank you so much, as well as Messi. I think Messi joined first, so I maybe.
yeah, you can let it off to one of them.
Good
All right,
evening.
thanks.
Hi, thanks for joining. Go ahead, Messi, and then we'll hand it over.
Hi. Good to be back. Am I audible? Am I good?
You're sounding great.
Great. Okay, so in one of the friend groups I'm in, they're now discovering the degree to which the concept of the individual in modernity is made to be superfluous. Not only in the sense that what comprises the individual is reducible to certain principles, but also in the sense that what makes you you, or what commodities you choose to affiliate yourself with, what you do with your time, how you self-identify, and maybe who you are in relation to others. You know the deal. But personally, I have my own reservations and thoughts. But my question is, how does Hegel deal with the self?
Probably the best explanation I've heard of this is from Jay Bernstein, who says, the notion of the self in Hegel is like spirit and team spirit, in that an individual is constituted within a matrix of relationships. As a matter of fact, you can't be an individual at all without a matrix of relationships. Outside of those relationships, you're simply a particularity in the world. And as a matter of fact, if you're the only one of your kind. You're neither universal nor individual, nor even particular. You're a blip in existence. The day you die, your kind ends. You came out of existence out of nothing, you go back to nothing. To be an individual is to be specified in some kind of structure. So in a team, in a baseball team, you're individuated within your role in the team. You're either the pitcher, the catcher, the batter, outfield, infield. That's what individuality is. So you're individuated within some kind of social nexus or matrix. This poses no problem for individuality. The fact that your individuality is open to these relationships necessarily, and therefore you're not some self-made freak that appeared out of nowhere, like say someone like Melchizedek in the Bible who just poofed into reality one day and then poofed out of it. I suppose, the only thing that I think people would find scary about that is to realize how much of their subjectivity is mass produced, particularly today. Whereas, why is it that most people end up wearing the same, there's so many fashions in the world. Why is it that, wherever you are at, usually most people, all dress the same? There's so many foods in the world. Why is it that most people are eating basically the same things? Well, you live in a mass society with things that are mass produced and things which are mass consumed. Everybody thinks that there's some kind of special individual, but the more you think that you're a special individual, the more you are like everybody else who thinks that they're a special individual. You eat McDonald's in the US, you eat McDonald's in China, even. You can go to various radically different parts of the world, and the more life converges, the more similar people are, just by the fact of mass produced society and mass consumption. That itself is only a problem if you have a problem with it, I suppose. I somewhat have a problem with it in that I wish that there were more people who were willing to go out of their way to be different, not just for difference's sake, but because they actually were different. We live in a society in which being different, well, and this is not the case that this is just modern. It's always been the case. If you're different in any society, people tend to not like you very much. You tend to be the weirdo who stands out, unless you're a very special kind of weirdo, like being a guru in India or being a sage in China. In which case, being a weirdo is pretty cool, and people eventually think that you're some kind of wise guy, and come and ask you for things and give you things for free. But if you become conscious of how your subjectivity is produced, and you realize, wow, I'm just like everybody else, and you're like, yeah, that's okay, then yeah, that's fine. But if it freaks you out, then I suppose someone would have to ask themselves why it freaks them out. You realize, wow, I just believe what everybody else believes. If that leads you to asking questions of like, why do I believe these things? Why do I do these things? And for you to judge that, by your own light of reason, you realize that certain things are bad, or certain things were are not the kinds of things that ultimately you really thought you were doing, and that they don't express the things that you thought that they did. Like suppose your rebellious youth nowadays. I don't know what rebellious youth do now. Back in my day, it was you got into punk and goth, and that's how you rebelled. Even then, it was mass produced. And if you thought that you were being rebellious by doing this, and that you were being an individual standing out, from the crowd, but really you're just putting yourself into another mass-produced identity, and you realize this, maybe that brings to light that you realize, I thought I was doing this thing, I'm actually not, and the only reason I was doing it was because I thought it was actually individuating me, but really I'm just falling into another mass identity. And then you actually do things that you actually want to do, and you realize that that's not really what you were into, that it's just kind of a phase, and you get a hobby, you get some kind of interest, blah blah blah, and then you actually individuate into what you really want. And if you're someone who's open-minded, you're usually kind of looking for new things. So you might be somebody who starts out with listening to typical hip hop, and you end up listening to someone like Bach 10 years later, and you're a classical music snob. But that's perfectly fine.
Was that your path?
No, not really. I've never been obsessed with individuality. I mean, I'll
I
admit
meant
that I was like,
the Bach thing.
yeah. No, I'm not a music sub. I do like Bach, and I do think it's pretty high up there aesthetically. But no, my path is more like I was just somebody who's always had some kind of affinity with truth and wanted to be true to truth. And insofar as I thought certain things were towards that end, I was trying to go after those.
Is that what landed you with an interest in philosophy? Just wanting to seek the truth?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I never like went out of my way to study this thing called philosophy, and I don't consider myself like a philosophy fan or anything because I'm actually not. I don't care what most philosophers say. I care about the truth. So somebody's like, "Oh, you should read this guy. He's interesting." I don't care that they're interesting. They might be, but the question is what they're saying true, and are they worth my time? Are they saying anything new that I haven't heard before? Somebody like Deleuze, I will admit to you, is actually very interesting. But I don't feel that Deleuze is worth my time because Deleuze is saying basically the same things Hegel says, but worse.
I don't think Deleuze is worth your time either.
I
Pessimistic
despise
idealism.
Deleuze. Hello.
Did you take over? Hey, thanks for joining. And did you want to take over with the questions?
Oh, let's see. I think Antonio is doing a pretty good job. I think he's really done a great job of demonstrating the problem involved with. Excuse me, I'm very clear-headed at the moment, as some might know in the chat. I think Antonio's doing a great job, so I'll leave it with him. To be honest, I'll do that.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for that short but poignant contribution. I see we have been joined by Dark Philosopher on the stage. Would you care to ask a question?
Hear me? Oh, there we go.
Yes.
I just merely have a question. So you mentioned reading philosophers that have more truth into them. So if I was to start reading Hegel, would it be more worth my time to also read Spinoza or Schopenhauer?
No. As a matter of fact, my experience with people is that the less you know about philosophy, probably the better. Because then you don't come in primed with presuppositions about what things ought to mean. And that's the biggest obstacle I find with people, that they can't get away from, I think this is what this ought to mean, and Hegel's telling me that it's not, and I disagree. If you can't put those kinds of questions aside and just follow along and see if things go where he says they go, whether you ultimately agree with the beginning, because I think that the main issue people ultimately will have is, even if they grant, like someone like Shelley may grant and say, I think that, given what he does, it is what he says it is, but I don't buy the beginning and I don't buy the end. That's a different issue, but at least, you'll get something fruitful out of it if you can go through and just see what he's actually doing, as opposed to whether you ultimately agree with it or not. And he's pretty well self-contained. Hegel defines everything in his own works. You don't have to know and go to anybody else.
Thank you.
May I reply?
Sure.
Because I actually came to Hegel through Schopenhauer. And it was actually, to be honest, through a bit of a dissatisfaction with Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer, unlike Hegel, is heavily influenced by subjectivism, which is inescapable. He essentially holds to, he tries to continue the Kantian project of bifurcating reality into the phenomenon-noumenon distinction. But at the same time, he maintains to a certain notion of thought as something which operates on an immediately given, some kind of sensuous material, some kind of bare, immediate stuff that is, in some sense, impenetrable to thought because it is given and it does not have a particular um, uh, structure which reflects thought. It's rather that thought somehow uh, divides it up and breaks it up and categorizes it in such and such a way. But Schopenhauer, he was an empiricist at heart. He maintained an empiricist theory of meaning, which compared to Hegel is very, very different. Hegel would hold to no such thing as what Schopenhauer would hold to. Schopenhauer is in the tradition of Locke and even like in the British empiricists as well too. He's really something which you read in order to move beyond. And that's why I would kind of push back just a little bit upon on what Antonio is saying and say that like it's important to read Kant in order to move beyond Kant. You shouldn't get yourself caught up in Kant. You read him to progress beyond him. Now with Hegel, I think on the other hand, though, you read Hegel to stay within Hegel, but I don't think you can dive into Hegel without having the prerequisites, as it were, of being acquainted with the past. So I would just leave it at that, basically.
Sure. People have different ways of getting into it. My favorite way is like I got into Hegel without any of the background, quite frankly. I knew like Wikipedia, like 10-minute readings of level of Kant. And what I found out is he just does not reference other people. He does not take concepts from them. So reading other people does not tell you what Hegel will think. Reading other people, however, will illuminate the problems that Hegel is dealing with. But Hegel has no interest in like saying like, oh, to find out what I mean by substance, go read Spinoza. No, he defines substance close to what Spinoza does, but in his own way, such that that reading Spinoza won't tell you anything about what Hegel does. But you should read back, at least on secondary literature, I think. Whether you spend the time on primary, I don't know. That's kind of a big commitment. But there are books I do suggest, books like All or Nothing, Transcendental Argument, Skepticism, and Systematicity in German Idealism, which gives a great rundown from Leibniz all the way to Fichte, which shows you the problems these people were dealing with and why it leads to German idealism in the first place, such that you see that it does make sense that besides the ideas that people have in analytic philosophy, that philosophy can be disjunctive and disconnected, that really all these philosophies, even when they oppose each other, were actually very connected. And they were dealing with the same problems, and that the ways in which they dealt with them were not arbitrary, that each position had some element of having a position of the truth, which others did not. And so they were cycling between these positions of, which part of the truth are we privileging? And that is an eye-opener. It is a very good exercise, and particularly All or Nothing is a very good book that lays out the arguments very clearly so that you can follow them yourself and see that these problems were indeed problems imminent to the whole issues.
Yeah, I would tend to agree that you don't read Hegel through other people, and Hegel has his own system of thought that he's working through. But I would maybe tend to agree with pessimistic in that what Hegel is trying to do is to impart, a big part of what he's trying to do is to understand the development of human thought, right? And so when when he's talking about certain positions, right? Like sense certainty or something, certain positions he wants to critique, right? He's not referencing anybody, right? And that's the sense in which you're kind of right. He just says these are the positions, and this is what I think about those positions, right? But at the same time, he in referencing those positions is referencing, in the Hegelian sense, moments in the history of philosophy in the usual sense, but moments in the Hegelian sense, right? Parts of the whole of the history of philosophy. And that's kind of where his dialectic comes from. Right? So I would tend to agree with pessimistic a little bit more, but I can see where you're coming from.
Hmm.
I see everyone's muted, so thanks so much for ultra politeness. Did anybody want to hop in with a question? Nirvana, I see you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Somebody kept sending me invites and it was blocking my screen, so that's the only reason I accepted. I don't have any other questions.
Oh, thanks for coming back up. We feel very cool to be graced with your presence. Okay, so I'm not sure if we're about wrapping up or how you're doing now, Antonio.
Yeah. If nobody has those questions, or perhaps one more question if anybody has it, but yeah, we can wrap it up.
Great. Well, thanks again for being here with us. And I'm not sure if anyone has. Maybe just let us know what your upcoming projects are if you have any.
Well, given that work season is coming up, I will probably not be working on anything for a while. I'll still probably continue writing some stuff on the Chinese philosophy front. I have this project, which is a Hegel encyclopedia / wiki, which may or may not come out this year, depending on whether I get the mania to write during work time or not. I mean, it happened last year. I was writing during like 10-hour days, 6 days a week, so it's doable. But whether it will happen, I don't know. Beyond that, check out my channel. You can join my Discord. I think it's been linked. Most of the stuff that I do, quite frankly, is either I post readings and discussions while reading on certain philosophy texts or philosophy adjacent stuff. Also, lately, I've been doing a bit more high quality recordings of readings of my own essays. Some of them published on Epoche magazine. The stuff on Epoche is probably the stuff that I would invite you all to read if you want to read anything from me, because they're sort of the more layman oriented articles that I've written, so that I try to bridge the gap between this insurmountable mountain that is the Hegelian lexicon, and trying to show people that it's not actually this alien language, and it's not this alien way of thinking. It's actually very mundane in many ways, and it's quite easy to grasp onto. The metaphysics stuff, I can understand why most people don't get that. It's just weird in the sense that most people are not used to pure semantic thinking, and it's just pure semantics at that point. I mean, literally, it's just about understanding linguistic structures, insofar as they are linguistic in communicating anything. But the stuff on Epoche is just stuff about like the problem of identity, ship of Theseus. What is idealism, anyways? I have some executions of concepts regarding literary analysis of certain things. Like there's an analysis of an answer to solipsism with the concept of Hegel's idea of life, as well as this book, which is a wonderful book called Lilith by George MacDonald, which has a pretty good section on what the meaning of that would be. have an essay on Berserk. If you read manga, if you haven't read Berserk, and you should read it. It's pretty good. But yeah, that's the kind of stuff that I've been doing. It's the kind of stuff that I will continue to do. I don't intend to really ever become somebody who does pop philosophy like the big YouTubers like Philosophy Tube and ContraPoints or whatnot. It's just not my style. I actually like doing the slow aspect of philosophy where you just kind of trudge through the details and work out all these very nerdy things about concepts.
Well, thanks again for being here with us, and I've shared your links in the chat. They'll also be in the description of the video going up on the Philosophical Plebeians channel. And all right, I guess that just about wraps it up. So
All right,
thanks for
thank
tuning in.
you.
Thanks for being here with
Thanks
us.
for listening.